Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this capacity building for the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly webinar. This event has been organized by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future in collaboration with the United Nations Environment. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this capacity building for the 5th United. Pardon me for that. Okay, back to the narrative. Apologies for that. I'm Charles Newhan, Chairman of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future. And I'm your host today, coming from New York. I'm joined by our presenters, Felix Dodds, who is in Apex, North Carolina in the United States, and Leida Reinhout, who joins us from Brussels in Belgium. Felix and Leida are senior advisors to Stakeholder Forum. For those of you unfamiliar with the Stakeholder Forum, we are an international not-for-profit NGO that has, for some 25 years, been working to advance sustainable development at all levels. Stakeholder Forum seeks to provide a bridge between those who have a stake in sustainable development and the international forums where decisions are made in their name. Before we get properly started, there's just a bit of housekeeping to attend to. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on the Stakeholder Forum YouTube channel. Apologies for the little glitch earlier. The live streaming wasn't working, but it's working now. And that recording, by way of a link to the SF YouTube page and a copy of the presentations, will be posted on the Stakeholder Forum website soon. As you will see, all attendee cameras and microphones are muted and will remain that way throughout the webinar. There will be 2 sets of 3 sessions, each followed by 10 to 15-minute question and answer period, and there'll be a 15-minute comfort break in the middle of the 2 sessions. If we do not need all the time for questions, we'll move on to the following session and make the best use of the time that we have. Questions should be submitted to the Q&A window, not to the chat window. So I'll just remind you, if you have a question to ask, please put it in the Q&A window. We will select questions that are most relevant. You have the ability to vote up questions and so that we see that there's a groundswell for any particular question. We may not be able to answer all questions, but we'll do our very best in the time that we have. Let's begin now by introducing today's presenters. Felix Dodds is an adjunct professor and a senior affiliate at the Water Institute at the Environmental Science and Engineering Department at the University of North Carolina in the United States. He is also an associate fellow at the TELUS Institute. Felix was co-director of the 2014 and 2018 Nexus conferences on water, food, and energy and climate at UNC. He's a prolific author on the subject of global sustainability, and he was also the executive director of Stakeholder Forum from 1992 to 2012. Leida Reinhout has been a program coordinator of resource justice and sustainability at Friends of the Earth Europe. In her position as executive director of ANPED and director of global policies at the European Environmental Bureau, Leida facilitated and coordinated the global NGO community to realize their active engagement in the United Nations processes on sustainable development and the environment. Please welcome Felix and Leida. Felix will deliver the first session. Felix, over to you, and I'll now start to advance the slides.
Thanks very much, Charles, and thank you for all of you for attending. As Charles mentioned, we're running this workshop with UNEP. We're doing one now, we'll do another one next week for Europe, and then later in October, we'll do one for Latin America. If you could move the slide on to the next one. So these are the 4 areas that we're going to cover. Session 1, which will be the first one, we're going to look at UNEA, UNEP, the medium-term strategy of UNEP, and then the role of stakeholders. Then we'll have a short break, and then we'll come back to look at what to do at the national, regional level. We'll look at how to attend the meeting and what you can do at those, and then what it's like to be a member state representative. And so that's today's work. So could you move on to the next slide? And then the next one, because we're going straight on. Next one. So the process for UNEA 5 started earlier in the year. And There was a meeting in Oslo, which they had hoped would be not a virtual one, but it ended up as a virtual one, of the Committee of Permanent Representatives and UNEA 5 Bureau. And prior to that, there was a meeting of the stakeholders for them to input to the meeting of the CPR and UNEA 5 Bureau on the themes that, or the areas that UNEA 5 might address, and then the sub-themes in that. We ran a capacity building workshop to help groups to engage in that process. It was a shorter one and was functioned on a number of the first slides that we'll talk about now. So that was an important staging point. There was, I think, 4 days with numbers of town hall meetings that happened after the major groups and stakeholders had met on the Sunday and inputted to the meeting of the Bureau and the CPR. As we move forward, well, a number of things are happening. So UNEP is developing its medium-term strategy, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And it's going to be preparing a ministerial declaration. To help input to both of those, the process will be around the 6th of October, when stakeholders will meet to prepare their thoughts on both of those documents for a meeting that will be happening on the 8th of October of the UNEA 5 Bureau. So we're hoping that the explanations that we do today will have an opportunity for those that are interested to prepare some input to that meeting on the 6th, and to have hopefully some understanding about the process from the 6th towards UNEA 5 next year. And I'll move on to that with the next slide, please. So the Bureau identified 4 action areas, or 4 themes: nature for jobs and economy, nature for health, nature for climate, and nature for sustainable food systems. And there was a reason why they did that. Originally, the Convention on Biological Diversity was meant to happen in October this year, and the outputs from that were meant to, in a sense, move on to UNEA 5 and to gain some traction and some momentum to deliver in these particular areas. So the objective, or one of the objectives, was to amplify the outcomes from the CBD and to take it forward. Well, the case is now that the CBD meeting has been moved from October this year to May next year. So it will act also as a kind of informal preparatory meeting for that meeting. And so a number of the issues that are on the CBD agenda will find themselves either formally on the UNEA agenda as sub-themes under these, or they'll be used as informal spaces for ministers to discuss what they think needs to happen at the CBD meeting in May. So it's going to play an even more important role, I would argue, in the sense of framing the success of the CBD meeting in May. If we could move on to the next slide. So there were 3 challenges based on previous UN Environment Assemblies that the Bureau wanted to try and address. The first was that there were far too many resolutions to get a proper debate on those resolutions. And in a sense, by getting a debate and getting momentum behind those resolutions, there would be a larger group of countries that would then be interested in making sure that those actions were followed through. And so their objective by moving down to 4 proposed action areas was to try and focus, and then under those to try and keep those resolutions to a smaller number so that they could really start to, in a sense, focus in a strong way on implementation. They were meant to take into consideration previous resolutions. So the idea was to build so that you wouldn't just pass a resolution and then let it drop, but where it's relevant, to build and move it forward, to address gaps that were missing, but also to link it into the medium-term strategy. So if you imagine the 4 action areas, and then we'll deal shortly with the 3 themes or the major themes that the medium-term strategy is going to address. There's a commonality starting to come between those, which then will strengthen the ability of UNEP to be able to be the environmental voice on those particular issues. Of course, you may have a viewpoint that those aren't enough issues, or that there should be other issues added. And that's the kind of conversation that is important to have as you move forward to that meeting on the 6th. And I was talking to some of the youth representatives this morning, and they're looking at the medium-term strategy on whether it's addressing everything that they think it should do. So we are in this space, which in a sense is very, very important, because once we've gone through this and through UNEA 5, it will set the kind of the agenda for UNEP for, in a sense, the next 4 to 5 years. If we could have the next slide. And so there are a number of important reports that if you haven't got them in your laptop or desktop, it's worth getting them. So the first report is, of course, the Global Sustainable Development Report that was produced for the review of the SDGs in 2019. It's a very important report because it deals with things like interlinkages, which are crucial to the SDG agenda. So it's very worth having, because also when you're trying to advocate for particular positions in lobbying, it's good to be able to refer to documents that have already been produced within the UN family. The second one, The Future is Now: Science for Achieving Sustainable Development, was produced by the independent panel of scientists that Ban Ki-moon had set up. And again, it's a really important document to have in your library to look through. There may be only bits of it that are useful, but those bits can be quoted to governments as important in being able to support your position. And because we're dealing with biodiversity, then it's the Global Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, and that's the IPCC for the biodiversity world. So those three are really important to have, in a sense, on your laptop if you're engaging in this process. If I could have the next thing. So the process from now to UNEA 5, and remember, UNEA 5 at the moment, it's meant to be in person. We'll have to see if it is. At the moment, it's the 22nd to the 26th of February. That's when it's going to happen. These regional capacity building workshops are, in a sense, trying to help stakeholders, or a larger group of stakeholders, to engage and to see where they can engage on the agenda, and also where they can engage on implementation. As we say, the next big meeting will be the major group consultation with the CPR on the 6th of October. And then when we get to Nairobi, prior to the 22nd, there'll be a global major groups stakeholder forum meeting. There'll be a youth assembly. And then probably during the UNEA 5 itself, there'll be a science policy business forum. So all of those, in their own way, input to the policy discussions that will be happening, but they also, in a sense, offer opportunities to show good practice that stakeholders are doing. Next slide. So just quickly, I'm going to take you through the structure of UNEP, and it's just to give you an idea where you might tag in the things that are important to you. So clearly the communications division of UNEP has a particular role. It's to communicate out reports that UNEP is producing, or its director or its ED or deputy ED's statement on particular things. It's an extremely useful place to bookmark, because it's quite likely over a period of time there will be something that UNEP is doing in a report or in a statement which supports something that you're doing. And so you can use that material either in producing a press release of your own to your own press in your own country, or using it in your arguments with your own government to try and persuade them to take up particular issues. So see it as a really important resource, and definitely worth going and checking. The economic division is one of the ones which perhaps most NGOs don't engage with, but it's really important. It has 3 subdivisions on chemicals and health, energy and climate, and resources and markets. It produced the Green Economy Report, which fed into Rio+20. And it was a substantive look at how the recovery packages from the financial crisis should be green. And that was exactly the same conversation as we're having around COVID. So there's some really interesting material that's worth re-looking back at. They also have a thing called the UNEP Finance Initiative. And this is something which is definitely worth looking at. And this is where they work with the different sectors of the finance industry to build a set of principles. They have one on responsible banking, one on sustainable insurance, and one on sustainable investment. They launched the responsible banking last year at the General Assembly, and it has 130 banks collectively holding 47 trillion in assets, or 1/3 of the global banking sector. And what they're trying to do is make sure that the banks put into their own modes of operation principles on sustainability. Now, they've signed up to these things, and then the issue will be for holding them accountable. It's the same for the insurance business, and it's the same for responsible investment. They do their own events. You can attend those. It's not just open to the things, but they also do webinars, which are also quite insightful as well. I'm doing a particular work on resilience, and so I was very interested in the insurance companies and what they're doing as far as insuring property that's on where the hurricanes are hitting. So there's usually some really interesting material there. The ecosystem division will be kind of very critical to the work that we're going to be going through as far as this UNEA 5 meeting is concerned, and it deals with terrestrial, freshwater, marine ecosystems. It includes looking at the products and services that have biodiversity produce. It looks at the consequences of disasters and conflicts. It looks at the reduction of pollution from land-based forms of pollution, and that would include the plastics issue clearly, and increasing resilience in climate change. So very, very critical stuff. The law division is where it helps to oversight and help strengthen national and international environmental instruments. It helps support environmental treaties. A number of the treaties, particularly chemicals and biodiversity treaties, UNEP has a management role in. It strengthens the institutions to implement environmental laws and regulations. It's done work with judges on helping them to understand how to take those international agreements and to deal with them in the legal framework of those countries. It advances environmental rights, and it supports the delivery of the global goals. The science division, of course, is the bedrock of UNEP, because the objective of when UNEP was set up was to try and create a body where the science would inform the policy. And the work that it's done over a number of years with its GEO report, the Global Environmental Outlook report, is been very important. Stakeholder Forum launched 3 of the reports, GEO 1, 2, and 3 in London, and they are a mindful group of information that you can use. And so though we didn't have a GEO report on those previous ones, there will be a discussion at UNEA 5 on how GEO should develop, in the sense the world we live in now is much different than the production of a book, and how can we make GEO much more usable for stakeholders as well as governments. And so that's a discussion that will happen at UNEA 5 and definitely worth engaging in. For UNEA 5, there'll be a GEO 6 on for business. There'll be a global waste management report. There'll be a pollution summary tracking report. There'll be a state of finance and investment in nature-based solutions. And there'll be a synthesis report on the global environment based on on other people's assessments to see where they are, to inform the discussion, particularly on biodiversity. So again, a huge amount of really useful information, and depending on what your organization's focus is, these should be something that you engage in looking at. The policy and program division clearly is where you deal with issues around the working with the UN as a whole, the global goals, ensuring that the integration of all the the resolutions that are passed, that if they have policy implications with programmatic work, that is overseen by that division. The corporate services division, in a sense, is the management division of UNEP, and the governance affairs office is where the major groups and stakeholders sit, but it's also the body that manages UNEA 5, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, those kinds of things. And then you, of course, you have the 6 regional officers for UNEP. So if you could move to the next slide, that would be great. So I always think it's great to see who these people are behind these officers. And so this is not all of the management team of UNEP, but these are some of the key people that if you're going to UNEA 5, you might want to try and take for a coffee. So clearly Inga as the executive director, Joyce as her deputy, both very approachable. Inga comes from IUCN, so she has a very good, strong biodiversity outcome. Joyce is one of the Assistant Secretary Generals. The other, Satya, is based in New York and in a sense engages with the rest of UNEP, but also manages a thing called the Environment Management Group, which is all the UN agencies that operate on environmental issues. And there you'll find a whole set of work dealing with the interlinkages agenda. So where there are issues on water, food, energy, climate, where they cover different agencies and programs, he is overseeing work where they try and work with other stakeholders to address those. Jorge is, in essence, the person who runs the UNEA 5, but also oversees the work of the major groups. Tim Carsten does the Program and Policy Division. He was 10 years or 15 years ago the head of the Major Groups and Stakeholders Division, so is a huge supporter of stakeholder engagement. Arnold is the officer in charge of the Law Division. The head of the Law Division was Elizabeth Maramba, who's now the head of the Convention on Biological Diversity and is one of the best thinkers that I've seen that UNEP have had. Susan does the Ecosystem Division, and Ligay does the Economic Division out of Paris. So that's your kind of top management people. Again, very approachable. It's not difficult to find their emails to follow up and set up meetings when you're coming to UNEA 5. Better to do it as a group than necessarily as individuals. If you could take the next slide. So the UN Environment Assembly. It was a result of Rio +20. Prior to that, UNEP had a governing council, met every year, had 64 countries. This is a universal body. It has every country as a member. It meets every 2 years. It sets the priority areas for the environment policy. It also is a great place for stakeholders to engage with that policy. It's quite an open space to do that. It identifies new challenges. There's an attempt to look at emerging issues. And it also works as a way of bringing the environmental family together on environmental issues. So you'll find, high-level representation from other UN agencies attending that particular assembly. Next slide. So just a quick overview. So you have the UN Environment Assembly, universal membership every 2 years, a 2-day high-level segment, a bureau that has 10 members. You have a committee of permanent representatives, which is in essence the ambassadors for the different countries or their representatives in Nairobi, though some come in from abroad because there's only 122 countries that have ambassadorial level people in Nairobi. It's supported by a bureau with 5 members. It has a number of subcommittees which deal with different things. So one of them deals with, one of the things it can do is it can create thematical discussions if it feels an issue has emerged onto the agenda that needs to have extra work. Next slide. So just a quick thing on the Committee of Permanent Representatives. So it's, in a sense, the management committee of UNEP. So though you have staff who are management committee, the government oversight body is the Committee of Permanent Representatives. As I said, it's got 5-member bureau, and that's because there are 5 recognized regions in the UN, and they elect 1 person from each region. The chair at the moment is held by Latin America, and it's by the Brazilian ambassador. That was interesting. It plays an early look at the agenda for UNEA. It advises the UNEA Bureau, which you'll see is a slightly different body. It helps advise on policy. It helps develop policy in its meetings prior to the UNEA 5 itself. It works very closely with the Bureau to make sure that, in a sense, the preparations for UNEA 5 build on previous experiences. Could I have the next slide? So the Bureau, has a role in advising on the draft program of work for the assembly itself, and scheduling all the different meetings that will happen. And as you saw, it also played a role in identifying the action areas. It's trying to manage governments to keep the number of resolutions down. So it has 10 members, and they're 2 from each of the regions, and part of their role on there is within their region to try and keep the enthusiasm of their members down and focus to the things that are on the agenda, and not try and take it off somewhere else. And it will also work, as I said, with the CPR to ensure coherence and complementarity, so that the process works in a smooth way. If we could have the next. Oh, and the other thing is they facilitate the dialogue. So you'll see the ministers or the Bureau members chairing different sessions. And so each region has 2 representatives on this. The present president is from Norway, and I think Bahrain is one of the Asia Pacific representatives. If you go on to the next page, next slide. And the second one from the region is Indonesia. So these are 2 people who, again, you can start to engage with prior to the UNEA, because they in a sense are representatives of your region and offer an opportunity of input to the Bureau through those representatives. If I could have the next slide. I think we're into question and answer period.
Hey, Felix, we have so far, there are 2 questions so far.
Sure.
Others are welcome to put questions in the Q&A box. First question is, what will be done by UNEP to address climate refugees? Are you able to give any thoughts on that?
So the answer to that is that I'm not aware that they have that as a priority area yet, but that could be a resolution that you want to raise. And so if you could find a government that would take that up, then that would be a way of doing that. So if you were going to write that resolution, we'll do a session on how to write resolutions later in the workshop. But it's a critical issue. We will come on to the strategic plan next, and I'm just looking down their climate priorities, and it isn't at the moment, as far as I can see, one of them. I mean, it kind of will be dealt with tangentially, I guess, under resilience. But I think it's a great issue to raise up, and I think it would be a really good thing to try and find a government to take it up.
Lyda, can you shed any light on the climate refugee matter? Are you linked into anything?
I don't know, just like Felix, what they are doing there, but I do know that this discussion is going on also in Geneva with the Human Rights Commissioner. But I don't have any details, but I know that the discussion is going on there.
Okay, thank you. There's one of the questions about the dates for UNEA 5, but we just presented them. It's meant to be in February 2021, but we don't have any firm dates yet.
No, we have firm dates. We just don't know that we'll have vaccinations by then. So sure. Depending on where we are, there are contingency plans for moving it into 22, and there are contingency plans for doing it virtually. So we'll have to see whether it's those or a combination of those.
Thank you. We have another question. It says, thank you to Felix. Great information. I'm interested in sustainable ocean development, especially for the Pacific region. Could you recommend some reports which cater for that, or a contact person at UNEP who I can liaise with?
So email me afterwards. I don't know exactly there'll be a regional seas agreement for that area. I'll track down someone for you. So email me afterwards, and I'm happy to try and find that person. I don't know of a report. Is it? But you know, we can discuss this offline. So happy to communicate.
And at the end of the presentations, you'll see the emails for both Lida and Felix, and they'll, of course, they'll be there when you have access to the presentations. We've got time for a couple more questions. Says, thank you, Felix. Is there any prerequisite for attending the UNEA conference, especially for students and researchers?
So there are two answers to that. One is that there's a process for getting your organization accredited to UNEP. And so if you are with an organization then that hasn't yet applied for accreditation, it's relatively easy to do it on the website. If it's of any difficulty, come back to me and I'm again happy to put you in the right direction. It's not a problem. Do that. If it's a student, then my suggestion is that you join the youth major group. And by doing so, they have a process of accrediting people, I think, that's beyond just the individual organizations. But Lida would know better than me on that, I think.
Okay, we have a question. Is there a contact point for Japan? Who's the contact point? How would they find that out?
I don't understand. Do you mean a UNEP contact?
Who is the UNEP contact point?
UNEP doesn't have country level people. It's not a implementing agent by itself. It's brought in for specific things. So it's not like UNDP, where there'd be in most developing countries people. There would be an office of UNEP, I'm guessing in Korea, as a regional office would be probably the closest.
Another question, let's see, you may have already answered this. There are initiatives on creating NGOs to address SDGs. How do we get support to establish these offices and implement programs?
So are they saying that they want to set up an NGO?
Yeah, it says there are initiatives on, it says, what's the statement? There are initiatives on creating NGOs to address SDGs. How do we get support to establish? I say, yeah, I think that's support for establishing NGOs is the question.
Well, I guess, well, we will tomorrow discuss fundraising. So that will be a place where we can give you some ideas on where you might do that. Depending on your country, you'd have a different form of registration depending, so you have to go through a registration process for any new non-governmental organization. So that will be your first step to doing something. And then, if you have to have a legal basis to be accredited to the UN as well. So if you were then thinking of going either to UNEP or to the High Level Political Forum, your organization would have to have a legal basis to do that. And if you want to go to New York for the High Level Political Forum, then there are two avenues for that. One is through ECOSOC, and the ECOSOC process takes up to 2 years, if not longer. There's a shorter process through the UN Department. I forgot what they call it now, but it was the Department of Public Information. It's now the Department of Communication or something. But it has its own accreditation system, which is a lot less rigorous in the sense of how long it takes. I mean, they do a check. You still have to have a legal basis. There's a whole lot of material, your accounts and everything you send, but that will be the easiest way. Again, if you're a youth representative, then you would engage with the major group on youth and children, who have a great website and engage in most of these platforms. And there will be a way through that. If you're a women's group, you could do it through the women's major group. There's an NGO. So for each of the major groups, which we'll be going into in a little while, on the UN website of the High Level Political Forum, there are names and emails of people who are coordinating those groups, who you can then approach depending on which group you fit into.
Felix, thank you. We've really don't have time for another question. We do have a couple others, but rather than take the risk of running over, I want to thank everyone for their questions. If we have time, we will get back to your questions. If we run out of time, if we have fewer questions next time around, we'll come back to some of the older ones. On that note, I think we'll move on to the next session, module 2. Felix, back to you again.
Yeah, we're gonna go through a little bit on the medium-term strategy and the program of work, or at least we don't have the program of work, but we'll explain it. So if you could take the next slide. If you press your button just once, yes. So the present medium-term strategy, which was from 2018 to 2021, the way it was approached was it looked at a kind of an overview of what was happening in the world, the context that we were in, the particular issues that were relevant to UNEP. It tried to focus around the SDGs and help to deliver those as a focus. And it looked at building a strategy and a program of work to help it do that. It was a bit mixed, I have to say. If you look back at the program of work, the medium-term strategy, sorry, for 2018 to 2021, it had 5 major areas, which included chemicals, governance, climate change, biodiversity, but it was more fragmented than it should have been. If you could just put the next, thank you. So during a medium-term strategy, to deliver the medium-term strategy, you'll have a program of work. And the first 2 years of that program of work will be, in a sense, looking at what they hope to achieve. So if you're doing climate change, what were the particular issues under climate change that UNEP wanted to do? They'd be looking at setting targets for those particular things. They'd have budgetary allocations for delivering those. And some of those offer opportunities for you as stakeholders to build a partnership with UNEP to try and help them deliver those particular areas. They also offer potential for small grants to help you work with UNEP on those, and work with UNEP to raise funds to do that particular piece of work jointly with UNEP. So the program of work can be really important for seeing where your particular activities fit into the program of work so that you can use or work with UNEP on trying to achieve that. If you could just press the button again. Once you've done the first 2 years, there is an assessment done on whether we're moving in the right direction. They revise that. It may be that the funding didn't come in for the particular things in the timeline, so they move the timelines to the following years. But they also look at new and emerging issues. So if, for example, with the next medium-term strategy, which we'll go into in a second, that it identifies for a program of work areas that you feel are missing, then there's an opportunity over a 2-year period to try and move those issues into the next program of work. So if you don't see it in the program of work for the first 2 years, you can work with UNEP staff and with governments to try and identify particular work that could happen in the next period. Too often, the UNEP process has been, in a sense, just been seen as a lobbying process where you lobby for policy changes. It can be as important a place for project delivery and where UNEP can be a partner in helping you deliver particular projects that you want to. And that's what the final thing at the bottom's talking about. What are the opportunities when you see the medium-term strategy? And we're going to go through it in a second. That won't be what we go through won't be the end result. There'll be more. There's opportunity to change it. Are there things like environmental refugees or climate refugees that you want to add in, which would then create a program of work for UNEP to work with people who want to do on that? So if we could move to the next slide. So there are three themes or pillars, I think they're more themes than pillars, for the medium-term strategy that they have identified. And I think they're really interesting ones. And I think that for many of us, we'll see some of our work there, but it won't mean that they're covering everything, because UNEP actually doesn't have Greenpeace and I think IUCN have more money than UNEP. It's not a rich agency compared to others. So one of the pillars or one of the themes is going to be on climate change. And if you look down the list of what they're suggesting for climate stability, they're focusing very heavily on energy. And why that's important is that there is no UN body for energy. There's an interagency group on energy. There's IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, but it's not part of the UN. And there's Sustainable Energy for All, which was a Secretary General initiative, which is now an NGO. And so it looks like UNEP's going to try and become a place where that energy portfolio can be done. And that might be a place where you could add in or suggest in the process as we move forward that environmental or climate refugees, I put environment and climate refugees, because water will also be, I mean, it depends how you define why we've got the problem, but it could be an extra area of work. Each of those, once they've been agreed, will then have to have programs of work to deliver them, and then they'll have to have projects to deliver them. So once you've defined these, in a sense, you've defined the next 4 years of work. And so if your thing isn't in this, it's more difficult to change it. In the living in harmony with nature, it's in a sense working with the CBD and the other UN agencies. And one of the things that is being part of UNEP's discussion since Klaus Topfer was the head was the idea that when UNEP has a success, it floats them off as conventions, and then it loses whole sections of work. And so the body as a whole kind of isn't as important a voice for the environment as it should be. And so Klaus Topfer suggested that what we needed to do was to move to cluster conventions. So bring all the chemical conventions together, bring all the biodiversity conventions together, bring all of the water conventions, the climate related conventions together. And then when you had those together, have UNEP in the center, draw the science from each of those and strengthen the environment as a whole. So that conversation advanced under Achim Steiner as the director, and he clustered the climate conventions. They then started to do the biodiversity conventions, and then that stopped for different reasons. Now that Elizabeth Maramba's the new head of the CBD, that process looks like it's going to, in a sense, be more likely to start to happen again. So if you look through the medium-term strategy document as a whole, you'll start to see the beginnings of the re-emergence of this clustering process. And you could imagine by 2030, the creation of a World Environment Organization, a bit like the World Trade Organization, a higher level body in the international system, but with all of the conventions that are relevant coming together with UNEP. And so that's part of it. Now, when they're talking about the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, that was assuming that the convention, the CBD had happened in October. We're now in, as I say, a very strong position to have an impact on that meeting in May, if the meeting in February happens. It's clear that there needs to be a relationship, a much stronger relationship between UNEP and the Rome-based agencies that deal with agriculture. So that's clearly going to be an area of work for this strategy if it goes through. They're also looking at issues on finance, and that's critical. So that will play into the UNEP Finance Office. And so again, a relationship, or at least being on their mailing list, would not be a bad thing. They're dealing with disasters as part of the issues on biodiversity. They're not so much dealing with it in the climate. So that would again play to that person's comment on climate refugees. Could we have the next slide? And so the third area is a pollution-free planet. And so to some extent, this was one of the issues advocated by the previous ED, Eric, where he was looking at things around health particularly. But one of the big issues that's come up over the last 2 or 3 years is the issue of the circular economy. And so that's, again, something where you're going to see a conversation which will feed into the economic office in Geneva and Paris. And that's also feeding into the conversations around the plastics discussion. So, you know, there's no point in dealing with it just as a waste stream issue that ends up in the ocean. That's a limiting factor. You want to deal with plastics as a whole. And so the issue of circularity will be a really important area to engage. And there are not enough NGOs, I think, engaged in the discussions on the issues on economy. So that's an area to work with. Clearly, the consumption and production issues will come in here, which is really important. And I think, you know, I'm not absolutely sure, Lida may be better positioned than me on where the discussions on marine plastics is, but there should be a decision on the direction that we're going in as far as addressing plastics at the next UNEA. And the question will be, will that be a legally binding agreement or will it be a voluntary approach? The strategic agreement on chemicals was meant to have happened again this year. It's been put off to next year. So you have a number of key meetings on chemicals that are happening next year after UNEA 5. So again, an opportunity to input to that. The next slide. So thematical programs, the 3 areas. If you don't think that that covers enough and you think there's something else should be in there, now is the time to start to address that with your government or other governments. Underneath that, they see, in a sense, the foundation being science and environmental governance. So that's, again, this discussion around clustering, strengthening the conventions, looking at the gaps, trying to reduce the overlaps, doing the interlinkages, all of that really crucial. And at the same time, strengthening the national ability to deliver those. So strengthening the legal frameworks in the countries, you know, following through with parliamentarians, all that kind of stuff. The enabling programs, the first one, clearly the finance and economic, the digital transformation is a new one that they've added. And I don't have enough information to suggest how that's going to be done. There are lots of other areas that are emerging where we are still not addressing in new technologies. So it would be interesting to see where the new technology discussion is going. More of that is being discussed in UNDP than is at the moment in the program for UNEP. The next slide. And so this is their diagram that shows you how they're seeing it. So on the top, you've and the pillars, you've got the 3 themes or pillars. Then you've got the foundations and the enabling program. Now they will, as I say, make sure that they're trying to ensure that whatever's being done is being done by a strong science base. And that's why I see the advantage of a stronger relationship with the convention science bodies like IPBES or ICC or the IPCC to ensure that those conclusions are coherent with existing science bodies that exist. If we could have the next slide.
Felix, the next slide is the poll.
Okay, go ahead, Charles.
Okay. We're going to ask all of you to answer the polls. Let's get it to work. Or is it not working? Lovely. Our poll function is not working, folks.
Okay, well then move on to the video.
We'll go back if we can get it to, let's see. Well, let's see if this, let's try it. There we go. Okay. If you would all be so kind as to make your choices, we'll give you, let's say, give you about 10, 15 seconds to do that. Okay, good. It's being populated. It's looking good. I'll give you another few seconds and then I'll end it and we'll see what we've come up with. Okay. Okay, good. Yes, we still got some coming in. We're good doing. We're good on time. Okay. We've got about 90 responses out of 147. So why don't I give everybody a few more seconds and then we'll stop it. We're almost at 100. I'll stop it at 100. That should be a good representation. Okay. Let's see. Let's see the results. Okay. Well, I think it's a pretty interesting distribution. Felix, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think we made a mistake of not putting other down on the poll, which
Well, we don't make mistakes.
we do. So I mean, I think that's not a bad indication that there's at least a good support for people who are already on this webinar who are working in these areas. So I think that will be useful information for UNEP to know. Thanks very much for that.
And we'll certainly share that. Okay.
I think we have a video to finish this session.
I think we do. Here we go. Now, Felix, I'm going to mute my microphone and you're going to let me know, but your thumbs up. If you're going to let me know what thumbs up if you're hearing the video, the sound on the movie, okay?
Okay. There's no sound.
Is one of the key goals of our transformation process. Our next strategy, accompanied by our programs of work, will draw the contours of the UNEP we want and the UNEP the world needs. An organization with a more coherent, transformational focus that can truly be a catalyst for shifting the needle on the environmental crises we face. The strategy development process is ongoing with discussions and engagement with key stakeholders until the final text is adopted by member states at the United Nations Environment Assembly in early 2021. UNEP is a science-based organization. Sound science that drives policies, decisions and behaviors is our imperative and comparative advantage. It is the essence of our mandate. Therefore, science must be at the front and center of our next medium-term strategy. If we listen to science, we hear resoundingly that humans are responsible for a triple planetary crisis, which is putting extreme pressures on the Earth. Climate change is warming up our world at unprecedented speed. We are witnessing an alarmingly rapid decline of nature and loss of ecosystem integrity. Economic growth is leaving behind an increasingly large brown tail of pollution and waste. We need to look no further than the global pandemic caused by COVID-19, a disease transmitted from animal to human, to know that the finely tuned system of the natural world has been disrupted and that the health of our planet is ailing. The common thread running through these crises is unsustainable production and consumption, driven by our relentless and unlimited extraction of resources from the earth. Acting on this triple crisis will form the core of UNEP's strategy for the next 5 years. Our strategy is beginning to shape up around 3 thematic programs, supported by 2 foundational and 2 enabling programs, for a total of 7 sub-programs. The 3 thematic programs will revolve around action for climate, action for nature, and action on chemicals and pollution. And these will be driven by the aspirations of climate stability, living in harmony with nature, and a pollution-free planet, respectively, in line with the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. These 3 programs, in turn, will be sharpened and informed by our commitment to science for policy and law and institutions that strengthen environmental governance, the very foundation of UNEP's work. When it comes to science, our commitment is to deliver science that can strengthen the consensus on policy-making options, identify solutions, and guide actions for environmental sustainability, equipping us to address the planetary crisis. On environmental law and governance, we will aim to effectively build national capacities to improve the effectiveness of these legal frameworks at a national, regional, and global level. We will also seek to enable systemations in finance and economic systems toward consumption and production in collaboration with key players and game changers. We will also capitalise on the best and emerging digital technologies to allow us to share our environmental knowledge and insights while ensuring that we are deeply connected to the world that surrounds us. All of this work will be amplified and scaled up through our multilateral environmental agreements, to which UNEP provides a docking station in the realm of international environmental governance. As we act on the 7 programs, we will also have to invest in several cross-cutting areas. We will work on transformational shifts in the gender sphere, operationalizing gender dimensions and non-discrimination issues in all of our programs. We will strengthen our work on special needs of vulnerable states affected by disasters and conflicts, and protecting nature as a tool for peace and resilience. We will capitalize on the UN reform to lift up our country-level work to new heights and build sustainable development frameworks that effectively integrate environmental priorities. Increasing our efforts in these areas will be critical to enable us to maximize our impact. We are not there yet at the end of the transformation journey. The months ahead will continue to be critical for the development of the medium-term strategy. While we engage openly with our member states, we will continue to ask for your feedback, ideas, and involvement in the process, so that we can deliver a strong, comprehensive, focused, and impactful strategy. Our collective efforts will continue to be a help to build on the pathway to a truly transformational strategy and ultimately a transformed UNEP.
Thanks. We put that at the end because I thought it was easy to explain the stuff, but I think they pull it together at the end in a useful way. So I hope that the contribution of going over the stuff, but then having the video to kind of give you a bringing together helped in some way. Anyway, we're on to the question and answer period. Charles.
Thank you, Felix. I've just opened up the box. We have quite a few questions. I'm going to just jump ahead to the questions that relate specifically to this section first. So bear with me just a moment. Here we go. Let's see. First question that came in as you began. I live in Alberta, where the economy depends on oil companies. I suppose we talk, how can we make a smooth transition to a greener alternative to oil and ensure that the economy doesn't crumble? I see climate change as a priority, so that's why I asked this.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that. I think your Prime Minister should be answering that. With all of, and you saw that in the discussion of climate, which is, there's a transitional period. We're looking to, create carbon neutrality by 2050. So the question then is, how do you move to that? So, we already have a situation where people are not investing in coal. We're moving towards reducing the investment in oil. You're having that with a number of big investors like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. As we do that, we have to be able to replace those with other things. So, for example, the soon-to-be President Biden, in his statement to the US citizens today, talked about 500,000 docking stations for electric vehicles in the US as part of the transformational way that he wants to move people away from using gasoline for that. So as far as Alberta is concerned, the issue is, what other things could you be doing there? If I was engaged in politics in Alberta, I'd be looking at, making it a hub for new technologies, or trying to look at being a place where it's a massive builder for wind power or other things. So it needs to think what its transformation is. It's going to have to transform. If it doesn't, then it will move. It will be a financially worse off. We have a period of transformation, and we need to work out what that transformation will be for each community.
Felix, thank you very much. Here's one a bit more specific to the process. Can you please explain what you mean by the clustering of conventions? What does this mean in practical terms? And how would it affect the meeting and decision-making processes?
So the good example will be the chemicals. So you have the Rotterdam Convention, the Stockholm Convention, a couple of others. They all meet at the same time, as they have overlapping agendas. So instead of having them meeting all separately, they meet together, and they have sessions during that time period that they're meeting for the individual requirements for that specific convention. But then they have areas where they discuss the interlinkages between those conventions. So it enables them to address gaps. It enables them to identify which of the conventions should be dealing with specific things. And it also enhances the science behind it, because it means that, and also reduces the need for people to be on the road for the humongous amounts of time to go to all these different conventions. They can go to, or 2-week session which covers both of them, covers all of them.
Okay, thank you, Felix. There's another somewhat regional specific question. How do we address the impact of black carbon in the Himalayan region? Does UNEP have any plan to address this? Yeah.
I have no idea on that. I mean, I'm not sure that it would be the right place to put it, but it might be. So, I'm happy to try and find you someone in UNEP to have that conversation with.
We've got a bit of time. I'm going to go back to, that was the last of the new questions. I'm going to go back to some of the ones from just before, see if there's anything that we can do with some of the older questions. I'm just scrolling through them now. Interesting. Let's see. how can UNEP link up with Blue Ocean's summits, as they are very conversant with ocean issues? I wonder if that's relating to the postponed 2020 Oceans Conference. Do you know, Felix, what sort of linkages UNEP has with that? Well, top of your
Yeah,
head?
I mean, so all UN agencies would have been involved, if that is the one that he's talking about.
That's what I thought.
All of the UN agencies that have relevant programs would be engaged in that. So I don't think there is a lack of engagement by UNEP for the work that they have responsibility. So they deal with things on the regional seas agreements. They would have the land-based forms of pollution from the to the marine environment. Those relevant programs would be engaging in that summit.
This is a similar question, probably much the same answer. Any collaboration between UNEP and the UN World, WTO, I suppose, I mean World Travel Organization.
Tourism organization.
Tourism, yeah, because it says specifically for tourism and ecotourism.
Yeah.
Similar to before, they're interconnected because they are part of the same parent company, so to speak.
So I'm sure that UNEP does engage with the World Tourism Organization. Tourism hasn't been a big part of UNEP's work. It was part of the old Commission on Sustainable Development's work. I think it's probably an area that probably needs more development as far as collaboration is concerned. I've not seen any people engaged from UNEP that I can think of, but again, I can check. It's not difficult to do that. So if you want to email me, I'm happy to look behind the behind the sofa to see if there's someone there.
Felix, thank you for that. There's a question about the research agenda in UNEP and which division is responsible for research.
It will be the science, principally the science division.
Okay. Well, let me just see if there's any more new questions. Just bear with me a moment. Let's see. Well, I mean, there's some quite general questions, which really, I would say, probably aren't quite sort of things we can answer. One question about being in India where massive behavioral change is required. How is something this big of a change even possible in such a short time? The biggest challenge we face is changing behavior, not just people, governments, and industry. So I don't know if that's something that we can solve today, Felix, if you want to make a comment on it.
There is but just going back to the tourism thing, if any of the UNEP's officers that were dealing with it, it would be the Paris Economic Office, I think. Okay. So.
Well, let me just see if there's time. There's time for one more question. Let me just scroll through them. Quite a them are just, some of them are just statements, Felix. So I think we'll then move on to the next session, which is going to be delivered by Lyda. So we're going to ask Lyda to there she is. She's back. Lyda, you got your mic on.
Yes.
Let me move to the next slide. Lyda, over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Felix, for the lots of information you already gave. And I think we now know a lot about UNEP, their programs, what member states can do. But I think now it's up to us on what NGO stakeholders, what our role is in this whole process. Next slide, please. But before we go into that, I mean, I will explain what are the best ways to be engaged with the UNEA process. is what are the definitions of what are the stakeholders? Because we often talk about stakeholders, we talk about NGOs, we talk about CSOs, etc. So I think it's good to know on where we are in this whole process. So when we talk about stakeholders, and I know that a lot of people, including me, are using those terms often in the, let's say in the wrong way, but let's say it is because it is more or less all the same. But on the definitions, you can say that stakeholders are the ones that are impacted by a decision or impact in decisions. So they are at stake, let's say. Social movements are mostly groups that are large, but are also kind of informal, because it's often a network of individuals or other groups that are really fighting for a specific political or social goal or an environmental case. Civil society is a kind of everybody. It's let's say the society that is organized, that is talking to each other in a way to kind of change things or to achieve things. It includes academics and local governments and foundations. It's really, it's more focused also on social change. Local governments are part of the government. Foundations have other tasks than really organizing citizens to achieve that change. I think what is important that we are all part of the global citizenship, so that we all see ourselves as part of a global or a world society where we can put those joint goals and common goals above our individual goals. Next slide, please. NGOs is also a term that is, you can push one more. Yeah, it's also a very difficult animal to define. Only on the acronyms that we have about the types of NGOs, in a survey, they found 48 different ones. We are not going to list them all, but we have the bingos, which are the big international NGOs. Those are the NGOs like WWF, Greenpeace, Oxfam, that are quite big and also international. We have the bongos, take care of those. Those are the business organized NGOs. So that means that it are NGOs, but in kind of serving the businesses, so the private sector. But they are accredited, they are seen as an NGO, but do have business interests as a hidden or sometimes not so hidden agenda. A little bit on the same page are the gongos, which are the governmental organized NGOs. Those NGOs often exist in countries where democracy is not that open, where NGOs are quite related to the government. So they speak the language and they defend the positions of the government. So that's what we call not really free speech NGOs, but governmental NGOs. On the other side, we have the community-based organizations. It's those, I would also call them grassroots organizations that are really organized by the community, by the citizens, by the grassroots organizations. Civil society organizations is getting a kind of synonym for non-governmental organizations. It's, as we said, the whole group of organizations that you can see as an organized civil society. We have the NGOs, especially in the process of UNEA, the environmental NGOs. In short, there is not really an agreed terminology for describing the NGO sector. So it's quite wide and broad and heterogeneous. But what we can say, if you push the button 2 times, yes, one. What we can say what they are not. So an NGO is of course not a part of the government, it's non-governmental. And it is also, if you can push the button again, it's also not organized primarily for private profit. So an NGO or an CSO, as we can say as well, is an organization that is really there for defending the joint, the common good, the public good. Next slide. Even in the accreditation process of UNEA, all the NGOs are accredited as NGO. So it's one big name for, let's say, for the accreditation. Nevertheless, within the process, and it's not only it's in UNEA, that's also in New York and the Rio process on the former Commission of Sustainable Development. I mean, it's something that was launched in Agenda 21 in 92, where they defined 9 major groups. So we have women, children and youth, farmers, NGOs, indigenous peoples, workers and trade unions, science and technology, local authorities, and business and industry. There was between 1992 and now often the discussion to open the box of Pandora and or add a major group or delete a major group or whatever, or have the discussion on the major groups. But in the end, they never did that because it was there was always the danger that if you start to discuss the 9 major groups, that you will end up with less major groups or more major groups or whatever. So that was a kind of endless discussion. So at the end, in the Rio process, they decided in 2012 that we would also have something like other stakeholders. In the Rio process, in the HLPF in New York, you have now quite settled other stakeholders, which is the group of the elderly, also people with disabilities or multi-sectoral networks like associations that are covering more than one major group. So they don't want to belong to one major group, to the NGOs or to women, but have, let's say, their own seats, their own role in the whole process. Within UNEA, we don't see that groups very active. There are that groups, those groups, but they're often, they see themselves as part of the NGOs still. Next slide. That's a poll, Charles.
Okay, yeah, we have another poll, and let's go with the next poll, poll 2. And as before, we'll give you a couple minutes to begin to populate this. We'd like to see which of the 9 major groups you represent, if any. In this case, we're beginning to get some good results. It's interesting, we have representation everywhere with the exception of workers and trade unions. At the moment, there are no representatives from that group. We've got about half of you, 54% have voted. I'll give it another little while. Well, again, like before, we'll try to get up to 100, which I think will be a good representation. We're a little bit ahead of time. So let's try to get as many of you participating as possible. They're still coming in. Okay, they're coming in a bit slowly now. So I think I will give it another 10 or 15 seconds, and then we'll end the poll and I'll show you the results. Okay, we seem to have stalled at about 88. We got 63%, 64% now. Let's get to 90 responses and then I'll stop it. Let's have one more response, please. Okay, there we go. Okay, as you can see, we have there, the largest is NGOs by quite a significant margin. But we do have a little bit of everybody, which is fantastic. We got some business people, we got some youth, we got farmers and indigenous peoples. That's really great to see that we have such a diverse representation. In terms of workers and trade unions, I suppose if there was going to be one group not represented, I probably would have guessed that one, but maybe next time. Very good. Thank you for that. Let's now move on to the next slide. Lida, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure that the workers are working at the moment. They don't have time for webinars, which is a pity, of course. Okay, so as I said, we have 9 major groups, but all the if the accreditation process is only asking if you're an NGO or not. And of course, within all the major groups, most of them are also NGOs or CSOs. So it's your own decision if you want to belong to a major group. Only not for local authorities, of course, and trade unions and so on. But I mean, within the women's group and youth and others, they are, I mean, it's kind of free to choose. You also have a lot of people that are a member of 2 or 3 major groups, so they receive information as well from the other major groups. But how are the major groups organized within this process? So you have the Major Group Facilitating Committee. That is a committee of 18 representatives from the major groups. It's 2 per major group. It's often one from the north, one from the south, a man and a woman. That means that for the 2 years period, which is also the period of a UNEA process, you have 18 people in that major group facilitating committee. And in between, they elect 2 co-chairs. So those are the 2 people that are kind of leading the major group facilitating committee. On top of that, you have the regional facilitators. So when you have regional meetings, preparation meetings, regional consultation meetings, the so-called RCMs, they also have as a point of the agenda to elect a regional facilitator, or two per region, often as well men, women. In Europe, it's also from Eastern Europe and from Western Europe, and I suppose in the other regions, they also have this kind of divisions. Those people that are 12 are part of the Major Group Facilitating Committee, but as observer. So they receive all the information, they're on top of all the recent news and decisions, but let's say if it's about the decision making, it's the Major Group representatives, the 18. Of course, sometimes, I mean, you have the discussion with all of you, so it's not so strict, but let's say, according to rules, it is like this. So what they have to do is to facilitate the major group and stakeholder engagement within the UN Environmental Programme. Normally, all the major groups, facilitators, they organize a list. So you have the women's major group list, you have the NGO mailing list, you have, I suppose, because I'm mostly part of the NGOs, trade union mailing list. So that means that those persons are responsible for disseminating news, etc. They're also responsible for kind of leading the inputs and the positions that the major group, let's say, has during the whole process. When we talk about several topics within UNEA, as Felix already told us about, they organize, and that's for every major group different. So I can't say how it works exactly. I have insights, of course, in the NGO major group, but there we divide the people in on their interest. So that means you have the experts on nature, on economy, you have other experts on nature and food systems. So we divide the people, or I mean, it's what they want themselves. They say, well, I'm interested in food systems, I'm interested in nature, I'm interested in economic issues. So then we kind of organized in such a way that we have our own mailing list, that we have a Google Doc where we can draft common positions, etc. And that is how it works in the NGO major group. In the women major group is more or less the same. On the other major groups, I really can't say you in detail because I'm not on their list. Next slide, please. I forgot to tell, but when there was before, let's say, before UNEA, you had still UNEP because it was upgraded to UNEA in 2012. We had a stakeholder engagement policy that was fit, of course, for the governing governing body for UNEP. That was also every 2 years or every year even. Now, for UNEA, we still don't have officially a stakeholder engagement policy. We tried to have one in UNEA 1 and 2, but it became very complicated. Also because the political context is different than before. So there were some countries that are not always happy with civil society participation, stakeholder participation. So in the end, member states, and I think even the major groups decided, or kind of, okay, leave it as it is, because if we start to renegotiate a stakeholder engagement policy with the current political context, we can be worse off. So that's why we are still using the stakeholder engagement policy that was used before UNEA, but I mean, it works quite well. Of course, going to UNEA as an NGO or stakeholder is not enough. I mean, you really have to do your homework before. UNEA 5 started already a few weeks, months after UNEA 4, because it's a whole process of the decision making on the topics, on how it is organized, etc., etc. So that's why it is important to be involved from, from the very beginning, from every UNEA session. For that, you have regional consultations. You can do that as major group, of course. I mean, that's something that the regional representatives can organize as well as part of the major group facilitating committee. So you can have this in the region, but you can also have it even on even a smaller as region. And then when I say smaller as a region, it's also sub-regional, like in my case, when we talk about the UNEC region, Western Europe has their own way of organizing, their own mailing list, etc. While Eastern Europe, Russia, it's also Russian speaking, they have also their own way of organizing themselves. But of course, when there is an RCM, they all come together and having an UNECE, the region of UNEP point of view. As stakeholders, you can be engaged in the thematic clusters. As I said, you can also be engaged in the CPRs and also in the ministerial consultations. That is very important to do that, because it's often where member states are also expecting input from stakeholders and major groups, because often major groups are more innovative, more provocative, more creative than member states. So they really like to hear the views from major groups as such. Apart from that, I mean, that's often, I mean, when I talk about regional consultation, etc., that's often a common thing. So that's from all the major groups. Often what's happening is all the major groups minus business, as business tends to be quite, let's say, individual in their approach, also because it's not always easy to have a joint position on many things with all the 9 major groups. So that's why the like-minded major groups work together in a group which is often NGOs, women, youth, indigenous people, do I forget someone? Farmers, where local authorities, trade unions, and business and science tend to work more on their own. Not always, but often. So every major group has his preparatory process. And again, that's absolutely depending on the major group, but also on the facilitators of that major group. I mean, as they are having the responsibility to take the lead, it's also according their point of view and also often their time. Then before the UNEA, we always have the Global Major Groups and Stakeholder Forum. That is the day or the weekend before the UNEA, the official meeting. Then it's again a change of information, a capacity building workshop, because it's you have a lot of newcomers. It's very important that everybody is more or less on the same page. And it's also about agreeing on working arrangements for the UNEA 5, so that everybody knows the protocol, everybody knows how it works, how we are organized, if we have meetings, morning meetings, all together per major group, and where that is. and also, of course, having a joint position on the issues of the UNEA. We also have Youth Forum at the same time, and a Science Policy Business Forum. So it's really kind of preparing, but it's not only preparing, because as I said, the preparations start a year before, but it's a kind of fine-tuning the preparations and the joint positions for the UNEA that is then afterwards. And next slide, please. Oh, it's already the questions and answers.
Thank you. Yes, we're there. We're a little bit ahead of schedule.
Yeah.
Lida, thank you for that. Let me open up the questions, and we'll start with one question is one asking you for reflections. Multi-stakeholder involvement is important for effective implementation of SDGs in the backdrop of the COVID-19 crisis. Any reflections, please? Lida, do you want to take that first, and maybe Felix can add something afterwards?
It is very important to have this kind of multi-stakeholder approach as well, especially when you talk about COVID, because that's not a single issue that is connected with many things. It has to do with animals, with food systems, with climate, even our healthcare system. So I think it goes even beyond UNEP or UNEA. A lot of NGOs are preparing that. Within the NGO major group, we have a group that is dealing with COVID-19 and having a position and ideas on how we can, first of all, prevent this kind of pandemics, because if we are going like we are doing now, then we will have a next pandemic next year, and maybe sometimes even worse. So we need a kind of radical change there in our way of consuming and producing and also eating, and how we deal with nature. And well, together with UNEP, because they're also working on I mean, there's also a thinking process, of course, going on there. We work a lot on that. It is important that this work is also done on the regional and on the national levels, because we really need to convince member states, individual member states, to also see and convince them that a radical, fundamental change in the way we are living is necessary.
I might add a little bit to that. There is a new process. The Global Forum for National SDG Advisory Bodies was launched a year ago. Stakeholder Forum is one of the founding members of that group. And also the UNDESA, the German Council for Sustainable Development, and the Finnish Commission, Finnish National Commission on Sustainable Development. And it's very much recognized by governments that the multi-stakeholder process is important. So there's a lot going on to try to improve it and to create an environment where stakeholders can better engage with their governments, those who are making the decisions at the national level, but also to provide mechanisms for the governments to learn how to dig down into the communities, regional, local levels, to better understand what's happening and to better inform VNRs and similar processes. So there certainly are things going on. If anyone wants to know a bit more about that, if you send an email to webinars@stakeholderforum.org, I'd be happy to answer any questions and provide more information. Felix, do you want to add anything to that topic?
I think, I mean, UNEP has I think a report out that deals with COVID-19, because I think I did a blog on it, which was launched by Joyce a few months ago. So they are engaged in that particular issue. I was more, I noticed one of the questions was around UN officers in countries, which of course is the new resident coordinator process, because what people may or may not realize is that that the previous resident coordinators, which were under UNDP, were member states made the decision to take those out of UNDP and to make them, in a sense, kind of ambassadors for the UN in country, and under Amina Mohammed as the Deputy Secretary General. That process we're only really at the beginning of that process. And someone was commenting that they're less sympathetic to engaging with stakeholders. It may just be the nature of the change. There's a lot of just organizational change that's going on, and so they're being pulled in different places. But if you were going to look at engaging with them or where you would engage the conversation, it would be through the Deputy Secretary General's office. And I think it's Richard or Robert Piper, who is the Assistant Secretary General who runs that. And I think the QCPR, which is the Quadrennial Comprehensive Review, something or other, which in a sense looks at what the country level activities should be, would be where you would look to put policy in if that isn't being done effectively. So if one was to say that there's been a pullback of stakeholder engagement from the UN office in country, you would take it through Amina Mohammed's office first, or Robert Piper, who's the Assistant Secretary General. If that wasn't working, then you would look to try and get a policy decision through the QCPR.
Felix, thank you. There's another question, Lida, from one of our participants. My little experience in the UN forums is that CSOs, whoops, sorry, I just jumped away. My apologies, as other questions come in, it bumped that one away. Let me find it. Oh, it looks like it's gone. Yes, for some reason that question has disappeared from my screen. I apologize for that. It was basically the gist of it was that civil society organizations tend to sort of not get much attention. Their voices are heard. They're the last ones, to leave the hall. And there's a question of if UNEA 5 is going to be virtual, how much of a voice will civil society organizations have?
Yeah. I think to start with, I do not totally agree with the fact that NGOs are not heard in the whole process. The only thing is that, and that's what I see happening as well, to be very honest, is that a lot of NGOs that are going to UNEA are just not prepared. Yeah. So I think if you are prepared, if you really know what's on the agenda, if you really are part of the process from the very beginning, member states are happy to listen to you. Because as I said, we are often more creative, more innovative, and we do have constituency that they would like to have as well. So I think it's very important that if you want to go to this kind of processes, that it's not a kind of, okay, I go to Nairobi, I have a ticket to Nairobi, and I sit there in a room and I talk to member states, because then indeed they don't listen to you, because they directly hear that you're not really following the agenda. So I think that's very important, and I think that's also at stake, that we have the right NGOs, and I'm not asking for the big NGOs, I'm really asking for people that are knowing exactly what's going on. It's a profession. I mean, doing advocacy work is a profession. I mean, you cannot go to Nairobi as a kind of tourist, let's say. So I do think if we are serious with ourselves, that member states are listening to us. That's my experience, at least. There is already a lot of research done on civil society participation when it is virtual. Of course, that is a problem. I mean, there will be a lack of democracy, a lack of transparency, and a lack of openness for our points to make, because it's not only in the room where we do our advocacy work. I mean, it's not the 3 minutes that we have every day to say something in the meeting that is going to make the difference. Is the contact with the member states, is your bilaterals, is organizing meetings with the NGOs and the regional groups, etc. So that is, let's say, our way of doing our lobby work. When we have virtual meetings, you can say, okay, well, that's very democratic, because everybody can now, even if you don't have the money, you can kind of be present because it's online. You don't need travel costs. But I think that would be very bad, and I would not really ask for it for virtual meetings. I mean, for this kind of webinars, it's nice, but for negotiations, it's not the way to go, I would say.
Could I just come in on both of those? So Jan Gustav and I ran a training session in Nairobi. We were, I think, the second day into the negotiations. And we had 70 people at the workshop. And I asked them at the end how many of them had spoken, how many of them had not spoken to their government yet. Now remember, we're the second day in, and half the hands had gone up that they hadn't even spoken to their government. And so, yeah, we were at a lunch break. So I told them all to go as we were breaking for the lunch, to go up and speak to their government and then come back and talk and tell us what happened. And they were like surprised that their government would speak to them. And then you have to think, well, why are they there? You know, if you're, I mean, there are different reasons to be there. If you're attempting to lobby, and that is the reason you're going, you should have already known the name of the government officials before you got on the plane. And you should have met them in the capital, because you can't meet them in Nairobi if you haven't met them in the capital, because they won't think you're serious. So I think that's the issue. And I'm 100% with Lida. You can't do negotiations by the internet. And one of the reasons why is that, and this is one of the reasons that you have to be aware that when the decision-making process often, most of the time, doesn't happen in the meeting room. It'll happen in bilaterals that governments are doing outside. And the reason for that is that now everything is transparent. So their government can watch their civil servant on TV doing whatever they're doing. And so if you want a government to move, you can't do it in the room, because they will be under instructions to do X. And the more transparent we are by putting it on the internet, the more difficult it is to get agreements, because you have to do the agreements outside. And then the more we get excluded from that, potentially, because they are then having to go on somewhere else to try and do some deals without our engagement in that. So there are whole issues around that, around, you know, where people are tweeting, oh, the government official said this. Well, that government official won't be coming to the next one if they've actually tried to do something good. And during the SDG process, we had governments that are quite anti-NGO during their formal presentation, doing humongous stuff for us behind the scenes in actually getting agreements through. And in fact, if you look at the HLPF stakeholder policy that was agreed by the General Assembly, that was the head of the G77 group for that was Egypt. And Egypt doesn't take a positive position with its own stakeholders in Cairo or other places, but meanwhile got us some of the best advanced engagement policies that we have in the UN system.
Felix, I want to thank you. There's another question which I think you really sort of answered between the two of you, your comprehensive comments, and that is, are minor NGOs with a proven track record allowed to participate in pre-UNEA forums or provide input as local stakeholders? And I think what you said both earlier about just how intensive a process it is, can't just dip in and out of it, would make that a bit difficult. Do you want to comment on that, one of you or both of you?
I think the reality is, if you want to engage in this, it's, as Lida said, it's a huge engagement, because you have to engage through the process if you want to. If your objective is to influence policy, and there are other reasons for being at UNEA, but if your objective is to influence policy, you have to do the big arc. And then in that arc, you have to have a relationship with your government that you've built. You have to build relationships with other governments, and that takes time and it's expensive. And even if with the best will in the world, they haven't managed to find enough money to enable enough people to come from particular parts of the world who should be in that room doing the lobbying. It tends to be more northern based, just by the nature of the situation. And so that's unfair. But, you know, sometimes some of the bigger organizations have made mistakes where they've actually changed the people each negotiation, thinking that's great because they're sharing it around, while in fact they're being ineffective. So if you look at the Beyond 2015 Coalition review of their own review of themselves, they recognize the mistake of bringing different people to each of the negotiations because they couldn't build a relationship with the member states to move the issues.
Felix, thank you
I
for
think
that.
it's indeed very important because if you bring people to meetings, and I also refer to the New York process there because it's less visible in UNEA because there you see organizations that are quite experts in environmental issues, etc. But in New York we had so many organizations and people there. If people ask the floor, and if they get the floor as an NGO and they're asking for things that are already, let's say, 10 years ago agreed by all the member states, then member states start to be bored as well, because then they say, what are you asking? I mean, this already agreed 10 years ago. So because if you don't know the history, if you don't do your homework before you go, and at least if you start to speak in this kind of meetings, then of course you have to know what's going on. So I think that's very important. But that doesn't mean that smaller organizations cannot participate. I mean, it's absolutely possible. Also because a lot of smaller organizations, they have one issue, they have one topic. I know someone that goes every time to the UNEA, he only has one topic, which is environmental issues in areas of conflict. Yeah. It's very specific, but he's very, very useful there because he's the only one that knows everything about it. And he has great contacts with all the countries that do have conflicts and environmental issues there. So yeah, it depends how you work. But I mean, and that's a 1 or 2 person organization. So it's you don't need to be, having 18 people staff to do this kind of process.
Well, that's very encouraging, actually, to hear that example.
Yeah, I forgot one thing, by the way, and I think that's quite important, and also for our next webinar. We did not mention that UNEP in Nairobi does have a civil society unit. So we have Alexander and Leticia in Nairobi, and they have the task to maintain mostly the coordination with the Major Group Facilitating Committee. Not with all the individual NGOs because that's not their task. I mean, on logistics they do. They maintain the list of the accredited NGOs, which is mostly about all kinds of documents that are coming up. And so if you are accredited, then be on that list because all the information is there. And they also guide and coordinate the Major Group Facilitating Committee so that they can have their meetings.
And there is a regional equivalent of that.
And regional equivalent is in all the regional offices. So for your region, it is very important also to have contact with your regional office as well, of course, especially also for the regional consultation meetings, but also for all kinds of partnerships and projects they are implementing in the region.
Well, thank you. And note to us, we need to put in a couple of bullet points in about that fact.
Yes.
Thank you for remembering that. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. So Lyda and Felix, do we have time for a few more questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Yes. I'll just read some of the statements. For instance, one of the statements here, I'll just read it out. I request that UNEP give some importance to elderly people too, and to the youth. And there are some UNEP people on this webinar, and we'll be reporting to them as well. So they'll certainly see those sort of comments. And here's a specific question. What's the process involved in participating in the youth forum slated for February 21st? Did we address that earlier?
I think for the youth forum, you best take contact with the representatives of the youth major group. You will find all the emails and names on the website of the UNEP. It's in the section of civil society participation. And there you find, the 18 names and the 12 regional reps. So you know who to approach for what. It's the youth major group that is organizing the youth forum, of course. It's the Major Group Facilitating Committee, together often with a regional network of NGOs. And I'm not aware on which region it is at the moment. Last time it was Africa. The time before it was Asia. So I think it's now Latin America, but well, I don't know. So I think it's best to approach them and ask if you can be from any help. Normally they're quite open for people that want to help or wants to support the work, because we're always dealing with too less volunteers and people that are willing to organize such kind of things.
Thank you, Lida. And this one, again, a simple question. Where is the February 2021 forum to be held? If it's in person, it'll be in Nairobi.
It's always in Nairobi. Yeah, it's in Nairobi on the campus. In case, I mean, it will be a physical meeting. It is always good to make your reservations for hotels quite soon, because it's often quite full. I already have a reservation for 2 weeks. You can always annulate that, because the prices are going up when you make your reservations too late. It's just a practical thing.
This question has already been answered. How can we engage ministers to listen to our views? You, of course, have given detailed explanations about how to do that.
Well, just a couple of things. One is
Sure.
that if we're going ahead, and we'll have to see where the vaccine is by February or January, but the accreditation will be before Christmas. So if you're an organization that is accredited, you need to, there'll be a date by which your accreditation has to be sent in, and it'll literally be before Christmas, because there's so many weeks before. Yeah. And the second thing was, what did you just say, Charles?
I'm sorry, I was reading another one now. No, that was about how do I engage ministers? But
yeah, well, so
another session. The next session we'll come back on that as well.
Okay. Yeah.
So what did you want to say something like that?
Well, so there are different ways of doing that. So often the European Union has met with European ministers, with the stakeholders. That's been at different points an annual meeting in New York, or it's been every 2 years in Nairobi. But it's also about just requesting meetings with your minister before you go, to say, if you've already met with the civil servants, to say we'd like to have a meeting of people from our country with the minister actually in Nairobi. And it's often a lot easier to get a meeting with the minister at UNEA than it is in Capital, because actually you could just grab them in the coffee shop. If you know what they look like, which you should do if they're your minister, there often will be places in UA you can just walk up and just say, look, can we go for a coffee?
Thank you, Felix. Lida, did you want to say anything more about that?
No, because that's all will all be explained in one of the next sessions.
Oh, that's true, of course. Well, just a couple quick things then. Our colleague from UNEP, Aurora Chung, has kindly put some details about the contacts for the major groups in the Q&A box, but Aurora, I can't copy and paste it out into the chat. So if you haven't already put that into the chat box, Aurora, perhaps you could do that, because that's where all of the panelists would see it. There it is. Thank you so much, Aurora, for doing that. There was another question. Let me see. Here's one. Is UNEA hosting an SDGs week? Any knowledge of that?
No, that's the SDGs are integrated into the whole process, so they don't need to do that. So you'll find that with the different resolutions, they'll refer to the relevant SDGs in the medium-term strategy, in the program of work. They'll identify which SDG they're trying to deliver and which target they're trying to deliver. And as far as Environment Day is concerned, that's June the 5th. And so if you're not engaged already or following World Environment Day, it's something which again generates a lot of material, and you can hope, you know, it creates a platform for people to do events. This year there was a lot of virtual events around World Environment Day.
There's also a resolution on the interlinkage between UNEA and HLPF, which is very important. I think that's mostly for giving some added value to the HLPF, because at the HLPF, which is under ECOSOC, they don't talk a lot about the environment. I mean, most of the people that are in New York are quite into the eco-social issues and not so much on environment. So then I think it's very important that the environmental issues are brought to New York as well. And that's why the EU had that resolution on strengthen the interlinkages between the UNEA process and the HLPF. But I think at UNEA, there is indeed quite enough attention for the SDGs. It's mostly that in New York, there is no attention for environment.
So I would just say here, so that Charles can paste it in the chat box, that on Monday the 14th, we launch a report called looking at whether the high-level political forum is fit for purpose. Yeah. There is a review of the terms of reference of the HLPF next year. It's been put off from this year, and Stakeholder Forum organized a pop-up webinar during the HLPF looking at that, and we were very lucky to have the former chair of G77 who helped establish the the HLPF. We had Paolo Cabrera, who had actually been he was the mother of the SDGs speaking. So we pulled that into a report, and we hope to continue work to look at the HLPF and whether the body that was set up after Rio +20 and before the SDGs were negotiated is fit for the job that it's being asked to do. So if you're interested in that, unfortunately it is on New York time, because it'll be 9 o'clock on Monday. But Charles will post in the link if you want to register for that.
Yes, I'll do that during our upcoming break. Thank you for pointing that out. We're almost ready for our 15-minute break. There's one statement here that I'll respond to. The statement is, I would suggest UNEP to strengthen stakeholders as much as possible, particularly the NGOs. What I would say is that's the whole purpose, of what we're doing here. UNEP has actually funded these series of webinars. This is the first of, I think, will be 5 altogether. Next week, we're doing the same for the European region. We're doing the South American region in October, and we are seeking support for Africa and West Asia. So, UNEP is quite serious about this, and very, very much about engaging NGOs, and that's why we're doing this today. Felix, if you want to you've been very involved with Alexandra on this. Do you want to say anything about it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. UNEP have been trying to do that. I think, one of the things we would love to see in the program of work is more funding to enable that office to grow in size. And in essence, the NGOs are one of the stronger groups. It's actually the indigenous peoples, it's the small scale farmers, it's the youth groups which are less able to participate, where I think there's a definite need for additional funding to help them.
Absolutely. Agree.
Good. Well, we are now at it's halfway through. We do have another session, 3 more modules. We are going to begin a 15-minute break. So don't be alarmed by the silence. We're going to all go silent for a few minutes. We'll be back in exactly 15 minutes. So that will be, it's just at the top of the hour now. So thank you all. Please stay with us. And we'll see you all again very soon. So again, we're going to stay live, but we're just going to be a bit quiet. Thanks. Hello, everyone. We are back. That was a very quick 15 minutes, but it's good to have everyone back. I see we still have a very good cohort of participants. We will now begin session 2, which will be led by Lida. And that is the Module 1 National and Regional Processes. Lida, I will advance to the next slide and over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so next one already. Next one. Yes. So yeah, we already went into that discussion. And I said it also in the earlier session that it's very important to be prepared once you go to UNEA. So that means, I mean, UNEP or UN in general is a member states association. So it's United Nations. So that means that the nations are the ones that are doing the negotiations, etc. Of course, we are happy to be there and we are also influencing them, but it is indeed, you have to influence the member states so that you can influence the decisions of the UN, in this case, UNEA. So that's why it is so important for an NGO or whatever you are, and a civil society organization, that you know what's happening in the country. So when your government is starting to do the preparations, so you have to detect who is responsible for UNEA. It's in the Ministry of Environment, but in a lot of countries it's also the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because it's an international thing, so that's based in foreign affairs. It can be also in when it's about natural resources, then it can be the Ministry of Natural Resources. I mean, you have to detect in your country who is responsible for UNEP or UNEA processes. I think then it's also important to have to know how they are organized. In many countries, it's not just one person or one ministry, it's also more ministries depending on the issue, of course. If it's about food systems, I suppose they will also involve the Ministry of Agriculture in it. So you have to kind of find out how it is organized in your country, and also if they are going to produce a report or a position. And then, of course, it's also good to know if it's possible that NGOs are able to be engaged in that process. It's even stronger when you work together with other NGOs or civil society organizations in your country, of course, and not do it as an individual or as one organization, because then maybe they're also getting a little bit tired of having to answer all the organizations. So I think it's better also to have that coordination within your country with the organizations that are like-minded. So one of the things is, as I said, and that was already said many times, is to contact those persons. Another thing is, and that happens in some countries, is if it's possible that you as an NGO or as youth or as farmers can consider to be part of the delegation. Me, myself, I was for years part of the Belgian delegation. I'm living in Belgium. I'm Dutch, but I was a head of an organization working on sustainable development. And after some lobbying, they agreed to have NGOs also part of the Belgian delegation. So that was me, an NGO, someone from trade unions, and someone from youth. So we had 3 people extra on the delegation coming from the major groups. But I mean, you have to consider that and see if that's possible in your country, of course. I know that a lot of governments don't like to see even NGOs, so even worse to have them on the delegation. But okay, that's depending on the country. Next slide, please. So what can you do in those preparations, apart from meeting the government officials in your capital and meet them and show them your views? Maybe it's also a good idea to have the topics that are on the table, on the agenda in UNEA, to have that as an issue for the ministry. So if you ask questions, if you have good contacts with political parties or people that are in the parliament, you can ask them to raise questions in the parliament so that the minister is forced to answer those. So that's, you may, let's say, make UNEA or the UNEA process and topics visible in your national politics. One of the issues you can always use as well is write articles for national newspapers. I know that UNEA is not always front page news for newspapers. I mean, even if it's happening, it's very difficult to find an article that all the ministers of environment are together in Nairobi. I'm always surprised that no journalist, or not a lot of journalists, are interested in that topic. To have, because I think that UNEA is a kind of international environmental parliament. I mean, having all the ministers of environment responsible for our environment are together, and that newspapers are not really interested in it. But maybe it's something that, if it's on a certain topic, to try to have some articles or in newspapers or in magazines or etc. It's always good also to organize your civil society organizations in your country, having town hall meetings or whatever. I mean, again, that's really depending on the traditions you have in your country and how big your country is as well. So maybe it's also good to have more actions in your country if you are living in a very big country. Next one. So are you working with other groups already that are engaged in the UN process? Sometimes it's also good to engage with organizations that are maybe not yet engaged in the UNEA process, but maybe they are engaged in CBD or in climate change or food systems. And they don't know that UNEA is existing as well. After the upgrade from UNEP to UNEA, my own feeling, my very personal feeling is that a lot of NGOs are still not aware on how important the UNEA is. They still think that it's UNEP, kind of implementing a program where civil society can decide or can try to influence together with other organizations on what kind of work UNEP is going to do. But a UNEA is different. I mean, a UNEA, an assembly where all the member states are member of. In UNEP, it was only the ones that donated for UNEP that were part of the governing body. But now you have the assembly, so that means that all member states are member of that. So that's much more political. I mean, it's not only about implementing programs. I don't say that's not important. It is important, but it's also more political. I mean, you can really try to force to have legally binding agreements. You can really force to have policies that are adopted by all the member states. And once member states adopted the ministerial declaration or the resolutions, you can also go back to your country and say, after UNEA, well, this you agreed upon in Nairobi, this, and let's see how you're going to implement this in our country or in our region. So the assembly is much more important than UNEP. So a lot of NGOs that are working on climate change, they go to the climate negotiations or they go to the CBD on biodiversity, but they kind of tend to forget that UNEA is also very important for their issues. It's also important to have your own positions already ready. I mean, a briefing paper, not much, but I mean the bullet points to have your priorities right, and also to have them jointly together right. So that is important. What is important also that once you have your priorities, to see if that fits into the text that is negotiated, that it's part of the agenda. If the agenda is, let's say, nature, as it is now, nature for this, I mean, for the 4 topics, then it is important that your priorities, you frame it in such a way that it really fits into the agenda and into the negotiation texts that are already there. So, and also it's always good and very practical to have some paragraphs, I mean, written text ready, so that you don't need to discuss that once you are at UNEA, but you have your, as I said several times, that you have your homework done, so that you know what to say to member states and other people that you want to try to convince for your issues. And next slide. that's the question and answers.
That was quick. Okay.
That was quick.
Let me see. Let's see if we have some new questions in there. Let me see. Here we go. Well, question, how can a private citizen contribute to the discussion in the UNEA process?
I think that's a difficult one. And I also don't know if I would really like that. I mean, it's really it's a huge negotiation with member states. I think it's always good if you have ambitions as private citizens to be involved in it, to connect with an NGO or a civil society organization that is following the process, and then do it via the NGOs, etc. So I don't believe that it's let's say improving our democracy if we start to influence this kind of processes as in one citizen.
Thank you. What I'd like to say to the participants, just to remind you that we are not looking in the chat box for questions, but you should please put your questions in the Q&A box. Further, I do see occasionally some hands being raised, but again, we're not in the position with this format to invite others in to speak. So if you do have a comment or a question, do please put them in the Q&A box. We don't have any new ones at the moment. I'm going to just scroll back a little bit. These are some questions from before, but we've answered most of them. So I would say, since there are no more questions, I will move on to the next section. And the next section is delivered part of it by Felix, part of it by Leida, but Felix, you start with it. So if you would please turn your camera back on, Felix, and your mic.
So I can't turn my camera back on because you turned me off.
Oh dear. Okay, hang on 2 seconds. Let me get you back. Okay. Here you go.
Okay, do you want to move it on to the slide that says multilateral agreements?
I'm ahead of you, my friend. Here we are. Okay.
That's fine.
Sorry, I turned you off before.
I don't know what to say. So, I mean, just 2 things before I go on to this. One is that Aurora put in the chat box the link to start your accreditation if you want to accredit to UNEP. And she said that it takes up to 3 months to accredit. So if you are interested as an organization, you should do that sooner rather than later. And then secondly, you can't have individuals going to these events. This is what Leida was saying, because the objective is to have organizations who represent sets of policies to come. So you can't get like millions of people going to UNEP. So it has to be through an organizational basis, which is why it's a stakeholder, not a citizens-based approach to democracy here. And so just looking at multilateral agreements, they form a wide array of different ones. So for example, the Sustainable Development Goals are a non-legally binding agreement. It's a resolution that was passed by the General Assembly. It's not legally binding. It's morally binding, and it's not something that parliaments debate. While on the treaty side, the legal side, you have treaties, conventions, agreements, protocols, or amendments to conventions. And then you have sometimes, that's why it's in 3 different columns, accords, pacts, and charters can be either legally binding or sometimes non-legally binding. So for example, the Rio Declaration, which is on the right-hand side, is a non-binding agreement. there are a number of conventions, clearly Accord conventions, protocols, Montreal Protocol, those are legally binding. UNEP's resolutions are not legally binding, but UNEP can set up a process for a legally binding agreement. And so it can pass a resolution to start a process, as it will probably do with plastics, for example. Next slide. So once you have an agreement that you're working towards, so let's take the climate change agreement, which was adopted at the end of the negotiations, and countries then in Rio signed the agreement. I think it was actually after Rio that they signed the agreement, which showed an intent to ratify. The United States actually ratified it, I think, within a year. And it was the last environmental agreement that they ratified. So I think they ratified it by the end of 1993, and they haven't ratified any other legally binding agreements since then on the area of ratification. Ratification goes through a parliament. So in the United States, it's, I think, 2/3 of the senators have to vote for it to become acceptable for the US government. It's not acceptable as a ratified convention. It then often will have another thing which will have to happen. So like so many countries will have to have ratified it for it to come into force. Or in the case of the Kyoto Protocol, it was so many countries and so much of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And it wasn't until Russia ratified, I think in 2004, that Kyoto came into being, because there was then, I think, over 50% of the, I think it was 50% of the greenhouse gas emission countries had ratified the convention. Move to the next slide. So there are kind of 4 important functions that we play in intergovernmental processes. And I'm going to give some examples of these. So one is setting agendas at the beginning, being able to come up with a vision. The second is engaged in negotiating the outcome. So really what we're talking about, which would happen at UNEA 5. The third is conferring legitimacy. So a good example, which we'll go through, is where the stakeholders no longer think this body has any legitimacy, and so they cease to attend it. And therefore, governments cease to send high-level people to it because we don't see it as a serious body. And then we have a role in implementing solutions, a role in taking whatever's been agreed and being part of the implementation of that. So we're going to go through a few examples. So if we could have the next overhead slide. So one example of setting agenda. So Rio +20. So President Mbeki of South Africa had hosted the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development. By 2006, it was clear that the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation had not been implemented. The Doha round of trade had failed, and the Monterey Consensus on Financing for Development had not delivered anything. And so President Mbeki makes a speech at the General Assembly, basically declaring sustainable development dead as a concept. President Lula of Brazil, the following year at the General Assembly, said, well, we better do something about it. And so he called for a Rio +20 summit, and he said that we needed to bring the family back together and define what sustainable development should be for the 21st century. In September 2008, the Stakeholder Forum Board, our International Advisory Board, which was made up of many of the key stakeholders, asked us to start to support the Brazilian push. And then in September 2008, G77 as a whole made a commitment to call for a Rio Plus 20 summit to agree to support Brazil. So the process had been kicked off by September. In November, Stakeholder Forum hosted in Spain a coalition of governments, the former Secretary General for the World Summit on Sustainable Development, UNEP, a number of other key stakeholders, to look at what should be Rio Plus 20 about, because Brazil had not put anything on the table as far as what it should address. And during that consultation, we came up with basically 4 areas. The 3 that I mentioned there: the green economy, because we were dealing with the aftermath of the financial crisis; emerging issues, things that had moved up the agenda since Johannesburg; institutional framework for sustainable development, how to reform UNEP, we're talking about that, UNEA 5, and also our problems with the Commission on Sustainable Development, the need to increase the level of commitment on sustainable development, which would ultimately become the high-level political forum. And then we also wanted to review progress. So those 4 areas were identified at a workshop, which was by and large run by stakeholders, not by governments. Governments attended and participated. That process then went in February to a dinner with co-hosted with the Brazilian ambassador, where all the developed countries were invited, because the developing countries were already on board, plus South Africa and Indonesia, as they played a critical role in the Johannesburg process. And the paper was presented to member states. And then during the process from February through to Christmas, when the General Assembly made a decision to have Rio Plus 20, the lobbying was around the issues that were on the paper that the stakeholders have put there. And ultimately, those became the 4 themes, or the 2 main themes and the 2 subsidiary themes for the summit. So here we had a situation where the stakeholders had come in early and they'd set the agenda for the summit, and that's what governments had accepted. So that's an example of where we had led the process. The next slide. So the next slide is on the SDGs. So in 2011, the UN Development Group developed a kind of comprehensive idea about how to move beyond the MDGs. And that was done in April or May 2011. But the critical meeting was in July 2011, was in Solo in Indonesia. I'd been contracted by the UN to do the background paper on institutional reform, looking at UNEP and the CSD. And at that meeting, Paulo Cabrera from Colombia, supported by Guatemala, Peru, presented the idea of the SDGs. I was then chairing the UN DPI NGO conference in Bonn. 2 months later, we reorganized the whole conference around the idea of the SDGs. And that conference came out with 17 SDGs. They're not the same as the ones that we ended up with, but this was the first conference that had come out. 2,000 stakeholders were engaged in that discussion. Because it was a UN conference, the issues that were in the recommendations for the different SDGs that we were suggested were then put into the policy notes for the Rio Plus 20 process. So in the one on the policy note on cities, it would have the recommendation that we had for the SDG on cities. On the one on biodiversity, it would have the recommendation that we had on that. So from the very beginning, the only thing that was available for governments to look at was the suggestion from stakeholders on what the SDGs should be. And when in November, Colombia hosted a government meeting in Colombia to discuss the SDGs, the only paper that was given out was the one that the stakeholders had produced in the DPI conference. And so again, setting the agenda was one of the important aspects of what we do. You have to be ahead of the game to be able to do that. Next slide. So negotiating outcomes. So the Habitat 2 conference had possibly the most open process of any conference that we've had. So the Habitat 2 conference worked like this. The first preparatory meeting was a disaster. The text that came out was useless, and so they decided to do an informal process between PrepCon 1 and PrepCon 2 in Nairobi. They came up with something else. It went to the second preparatory meeting. That was an utter failure. They decided to have another informal process in Paris. I attended, as did a number of other NGOs, at the informal meeting in Paris. We had a set of amendments that we would like to see to the document that was being negotiated. At that informal meeting, we were treated as if we were governments. There was no, that's the Americans or whatever. If we had a suggestion for text amendments in there, then provided we had a government that would support it, it went in and then it was negotiated. So it was a very interesting example where we ended up with a number of government and NGO amendments going into the document because the process was very open. That continued during the summit itself, where we were allowed to enter text into the negotiations, and if a government picked it up, then it became part of the negotiated text. We had been able to do that because of building relationships with the key people who were chairing the process. And the person in this case who helped us do that was the Pakistan ambassador, who had been chairing the Committee of Permanent Representatives, who had been so impressed by what had happened in the Paris process that when he chaired the summit in Istanbul, he continued that process and governments did not object to it. So being engaged in negotiating the outcomes, you can build those relationships and have a big impact. The second one, next one. So this is an interesting one. So there was a push not from the health side, but actually from the animal campaigning groups. This was in this case the World Animal Protection. We're trying to get some text in as a target in the Sustainable Development Group's Open Working Group, Sustainable Goals Open Working Group. The WHO brought out this report saying that there were going to be 100 million people who would die because we were going to become antibiotic resistance. But it happened at exactly the same time as the Ebola crisis. And so Sweden tried to get some text in. We were supporting them. We were unable to get any text during the Open Working Group. And this example is an example that don't ever give up. Because what happened then is during the period between the end of the Open Working Group and the negotiations for the SDG or the 2030 Agenda, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, there'd been a report by President Obama's team, there'd been a report by the British government, again, identifying that this was a critical issue because we were becoming antibiotic resistant. And the reason why the World Animal Protection were involved was because all of the animals were becoming antibiotic resistant as well. That's what they could see, and that was going to then affect the food chain and their health as well. And so we were unable to get the text in during the pretty much all the negotiations of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee in 2015 until the last 2 weeks of the negotiations. On the Friday of the penultimate week, Ashok, who works with, was then one of the coordinators for the Youth Caucus, approached me for us to have one final attempt. And we went into the room at 6 o'clock. They were breaking. It was a very good mood. He approached the EU, I approached the United States, and we spoke to them about the need to add something in on antibiotic resistance. And that was in the text by the time it came back on Monday. And so don't ever give up is the example here. If you care about those issues, we had been trying over 2 years to get that in. In the end, you know, partly because of the work that had been done by the Obama report and by the one by the British, it had added an understanding among enough of the civil servants to ensure that they supported it. Next slide.
Felix, forgive me, before I move to the next slide, in my sharing screen mode, I can't see the transition from slide 58 to 59. So if you'd remind us when that is, I'd appreciate it.
I don't have numbers, so that won't help me.
Well, do you, if Lida remembers?
No, I know when it happens. Yeah,
You know when it is. Okay,
yeah.
super. Okay, here's your slide.
Yeah, and the third one is a fascinating approach which exists around chemicals. I don't know if any of you are involved in the SICOM process, but in that process it's a strategic approach for international chemical management. In that process, you have the NGOs, labor, and the industry all having seats at the table as far as being able to put text into to the framework. So it's a very interesting example. IPENS also has helped in the context of the Mercury Convention. There are also examples of how substantive engagement has been done also around UN AIDS and OCHA. So I think there's some interesting examples about how, in a sense, stakeholders have moved from just being able to make those 3-minute statements to being able to bring text into negotiations. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, so conferring legitimacy. So the NGOs, in a sense, were one of the major supporters for the creation of the Commission on Sustainable Development. The Americans, the British, and a number of other countries didn't want any institution to follow up the Rio 1992 conference. G77 wanted a stronger body, and in the end, the suggestion of this functioning commission of ECOSOC was put forward by the NGOs and then in a sense taken forward by G77. The NGOs also put forward the suggestion that in the cycle from 2003 after Johannesburg to what ultimately became, I think, 2012, that we should have a 2-year cycle. The first year should be, in a sense, a review of implementation, and based on the review, the second year should then have policy changes based on what worked and what didn't. That process didn't work as well, but it was an example of how we had an impact in the context of framing the agenda that the CSD did. In 2007, there was no agreement on climate change. There was the first time that the CSD didn't agree any policy decisions. And by the 2011, it was clear, because we then had a failure over chemicals, and it was a second CSD that had failed to deliver any substantive policy decisions. It was clear that the body was too weak. And so the stakeholders, pretty much all of us, declared that we would not come back to the CSD after Rio +20, that we wanted a new body. And that spurred governments on to think about what a new body should look like. So by us indicating we no longer had any support for that body, we were able to generate a discussion about what the new body should look like. Next slide. So just a little bit on understanding countries. So at the moment, we have Germany, who's the president of the EU. We have Portugal, who will take over during UNEA next year. In New York, Guyana's the chair of G77. At the moment, it's still Palestine in Nairobi. I don't know whether they're working a year late, because it was Palestine last year for New York. So it may be that Guyana will take over at the beginning of the year. I'm not sure on that. Knowing who's in those positions are very important, because if you are going to be working with lobbying the EU, then having a relationship with Germany is a good thing. If you're working with G77, then clearly a relationship with Guyana is really important. In negotiations, and it changes depending on which negotiations, but often these are key countries. So Argentina often plays a key role. Brazil, as we see, as the chair of the Committee of Permanent Representatives. Bolivia, Colombia, because of their kind of, in a sense, having born the SDGs. China will play a critical role, Cuba, Egypt. And Egypt has been very, very positive in New York, less so in Nairobi. So you have a different set of players. Doesn't necessarily mean you get the same positive impact. Guatemala played a critical role in the SDGs. India, Indonesia, Kenya. These are all the key countries that have over the years played important roles. Within the EU, again, this can change depending on individuals, but Germany's always playing a critical role. France, Denmark, the Czech Republic was president of ECOSOC last year. At the moment, it's Norway, and I'm not sure who Norway handed over to. I think it was Mexico, but I'm not absolutely sure. So it depends on who they are. For single decision countries, so when you're into the negotiations, you don't actually want to talk to the EU because they're going to have to coordinate among 26 countries. And so that's going to take forever. You want to go for single decision countries at UNEA 5. So you go to Canada, because if you can persuade the Canadians, then they can present it. You can do the same with Monaco. You can do the same with Mexico, with Korea. If you find a single decision country that doesn't have to go to G77 or go to the EU or go to a subgroup, that it makes it much more likely that you'll be able to get something through. Of course, if you've got the support beforehand for something from a large group, then that's even better. But if you're just arriving and you're trying to deal with text amendments, it's easier to work with single decision countries. Next slide. So this goes back to something that Lyda was saying. It's not just, in a sense, the person who is at the venue. So the other venue here being Nairobi. So if there's a particular issue that's coming up, do they need to consult with a capital person? Yes, they do. Well, in which case that you need to make sure that you're talking to both of those. If it's in New York, is the New York representative talking to capital? If it's on agriculture, then it could be that they're talking to capital and they're talking to their representative FAO. So it's not necessarily just one person. It's not necessarily one person in capital, as Lyda said. It will be an interdepartmental committee, but you need to be aware of where those instructions are going to come. So instructions will come from capital for some of the text. For other bits of the text, they won't, but they might come from another venue if it's relevant to that venue. So be aware of that. Next slide. So there are different types of brackets. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of story about a staff person of mine. So I had done this presentation about brackets, alternative brackets. What do alternative brackets mean? What do contentious brackets mean? So alternative brackets are where there are different forms of text that are going in. You need to know who's proposing those. It may not be, it's unlikely to be said in the on the piece of paper. Contentious brackets will be where they put something because they think they don't agree with it, so it's contentious. There'll be suspicious brackets where they think someone's up to something, and so they bracket it because they're not sure what they're up to. There'll be tactical or trading brackets, so they may in fact be at UNEA 5 trading brackets between different resolutions, not even in the resolution. So there may be something in different resolutions and they do a deal across resolutions. There may be uncertain brackets, which means they're not really sure what they're trying to do there. There'll be waiting brackets when they're waiting because they've extended beyond what the instructions from capital. They need to wait till capital wakes up. So therefore they have to bracket it until they get new instructions. And then there's weary brackets, brackets when people are exhausted. So I told my staff this, I went through all this, and in a negotiating during the Johannesburg process, one of my staff, new staff, came up and she said, I don't understand. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, they haven't footnoted which are alternative brackets or which are contentious brackets. And so she assumed that they would actually footnote what they were. And I said, no, you have to work that out yourself. And the best way you do that is to talk to them. So if you can put the next slide up. So you need to know who put the bracket in. So when I'm running a team, we'll have someone in the room and their job is to keep an eye on exactly those kinds of things. You need to know who put it forward and why. So if it's not obvious, you have to go up and ask them when you have a break. Why did you put it in? What's your, what's the intent here? When you know why, it may not be clear to other delegations why they put it in. So you can play an important role in helping bridge that. If you want to put the next slide. If it's because they're waiting for instructions from capital, then get on the phone to colleagues in capital to get pressure put on the minister or the relevant civil servant. I've done that often. Once you know it's a capital decision, then you make sure you've got a team back in capital who will actually be ready to ring the minister up or to tweet to the minister or whatever to make sure that they are on side. If it involves trading brackets, make sure that you're not doing something that's going to undermine a colleague who's working in a different section. So you need to make sure that if they are trading brackets, you know what they're trading and you're speaking to the other people who are working in that resolution or that part of the resolution that you're working in to make sure that you're not undermining them. If it's exhaustion brackets, then you can sometimes be the person who suggests the text changes. I've been there at 4 a.m. in the morning and where the governments have run out of suggestions and they've turned to us and asked us if we have suggestions, and we've managed to get stuff in there. But often there are not many NGOs who'll stay there till 4 or 5 in the morning. If they're suspicious brackets, then one of the things that you can do is help build the trust. So I'm going to hand over to Lida now. Charles, if you want to hand it back and let the next one go.
Yes, thank you, Felix. I think you already understood that the whole negotiation process can be quite complicated. You have to be there, you need the information, etc., etc. It's also a kind of game where you have to be quite strategic as well in your intervention. So one of the things that some countries are offering, or you can maybe ask for it, is to be part of the government delegation. It has its pros and its cons, of course. His pros is, of course, that you have access to all the briefings of your country, so you know what they're up to. You have better insights on the decisions and on the positions. It is also often when they have this kind of briefings, they also tell you what other countries are up to. So if I refer to the bracketing of Felix, then you know what kind of brackets they are putting and how they deal with it. So you have a lot of inside information that is very important for you also as an NGO to work. You may be able to sit in the delegation meetings within the blocks, so that in my case, when I was part of the Belgian delegation, they were quite open for the NGOs and, as I said, trade unions and youth to be part of all the negotiations they have internally. And as you know, Belgium has 5 parliaments, so they also have a lot of negotiations in between them. You will be able to push for the NGOs or stakeholder positions towards your delegation. But I have to say that it can also be the other way around, because I often was in the position that the Belgian delegation of the EU delegation asked us, the NGOs, to push for things, because they are, of course, strategic as well. So they need often the stakeholders as well in making their points. And of course, if we agreed, then we could, of course, agree in pushing for their points as well. But it's really good to know where we are on both sides. Often what was also done is that you also serve as an intermediate between the NGOs and the government when there is a conflict, or when there is a kind of misunderstanding or whatever on content or on process. You are the ones that is fit for purpose to intermediate between the government and the NGO group. Because you have all those insights, you're also aware on possible movements in the negotiations, and that is very helpful for the major groups as well. And what is, I think, even as much as important, that if you have good relationships with your delegations, because it's not only the meetings, it's not only being at UNEA, it's also being invited in all kinds of parties and receptions and whatever. And that's not always with only your own delegation, but also with the other officials. So you're really part of the, let's say, the happy few that are that are really near to the information that you need for doing your own work. Next slide, please. But of course, it also has downsides. If you are joining a governmental delegation, you have the official badge. In my case, I had the badge of Belgium. So not an NGO badge, but an official badge, a member state badge. Often that in my case, it was not the fact, but I mean, in many countries, they ask, or you have to write or sign documents that you don't speak about the things that were discussed within the meetings, etc., which I think is a fair thing to do, because it's it's a kind of fair play as well. So everybody has his own strategy as a country to make their points, to have their points in. So I think that was a fair thing to ask. It can be the case that other NGOs are looking at you because you have an official badge, so they see you as part of the government. So maybe they even think that you're a gongo, and governmental NGO. Maybe for some countries that is the case. In a lot of countries that's not the case. So I think that is I think you have to be very transparent also on what's your role at the delegation, and what are your limitations as well. Sometimes it is indeed difficult. Once I had a big fight with the guy from, we all know them, Matushak from the US, because I had a Belgian badge, even if I was an NGO. There was a conflict between the Belgian delegation or the European delegation, but Belgium was really quite fanatic on that, on some of the topics of sustainable consumption and production, while the US delegation was quite on the opposite side. And so the US delegate, the leader of the chair of the delegation, he came to me and he was very, very furious with me and said that he would blah, blah, blah. And the whole thing even got physical. So I was quite afraid. And then I suddenly thought, why me? And then I said, oh yeah, because it's my Belgian badge. It's not because I'm me or an NGO. It was because of my Belgian badge. Sometimes it's very easy. I mean, it's also nice to be part of the Belgian delegation. I remember in Bali, when the NGOs wanted to have a big event within the venue. Later, I will say that it's not allowed, but anyhow, sometimes they do it. And as the bags were always controlled of all the NGO people, and not from the member states people, so from the official delegations. So Greenpeace asked me to put the big banner they had in my rucksack. And I could go in without being controlled. So afterwards, the security was really looking at me. Well, I think it was you that brought in that big banner that Greenpeace rolled out in during the event. So it has its pros and cons. But of course, it's also sometimes difficult for an NGO to speak out. At that time, I was the organizing partner in New York for the NGO, so I often had to take the floor for speaking in the plenaries. And once I said something that was kind of bold, I would say, because the NGOs were not very happy with the way everything was going. So I was quite bold in my intervention, and then I directly received a text message from one of the Belgian delegations that was not allowed to say that. Well, okay, we had a whole discussion. I said, well, I'm still an NGO, so I can talk as the NGOs. And then they had a discussion and said, yeah, okay, it's fine. I mean, but you have to be clear that you speak as an NGO and not as the Belgian delegation. So yes, I mean, there are some sometimes some misunderstandings and problems, but I think it's very good to be on a delegation, especially for what I said in the beginning, to have the insights of the negotiations, to know why things are bracketed or not, where they have space for the trading, where they have space for, I mean, for leaving it or still putting things in. So it is interesting to be part of the delegation. And I also think that you have all the arguments to ask for it, because it's a Belgian delegation. The delegation is representing, let's say, the country, which is part of the government, but having civil society organization on it, I think, is a fair thing to ask. Next slide, please. So again, what can you do as stakeholders? I think we already mentioned it several times. It's really that it's very important that you do really the whole negotiations, so that you absolutely do, I think, most of the work before you go to any UN meeting. You detect other groups in your country, region that you can coordinate with, because the bigger your network or your constituency is, I mean, the better you are heard, of course. Having several meetings in your capitals before you go with the people that are influencing or involved in the process. Having your points made, and also raise the fact that a UNEA is going to happen in the media. Having, if possible, debates in the parliament, but also have a group of people that can be done often in a Skype group or in a WhatsApp group, where if something is happening, that you are in contact with them. So you call it a kind of rapid response mechanism. So that's very important to have that, so that you always are backed if something changed, and you can also change your opinion on things. And again, try to get an NGO or someone else from another major group into the delegation. Next one. Part of the homework that is necessary is to have a clear overview of who is doing what. In the beginning, we already had some pictures of the UN staff management. It is good if you're working on a certain issue that you know who is responsible for that, and also have a picture of that person, so that once you are at the UNEP campus, that you recognize those people and that you can speak with them. Have your contacts for all the key people that you think you're going to approach. It's important to do that on forehand as well. If you're from a bigger organization, if not, you have to organize that within your major group, is that you have floor managers, because we are sometimes you have breakout groups and parallel sessions. It is important to be in contact with people that are present in the parallel sessions, so that you can update each other and also respond quite, adequately on things that are happening in those negotiation rooms. Because it's very difficult for one person to follow everything. I mean, don't even try. You really need to work in a team. If it's not within your own network of like-minded organizations or organizations working on a certain topic, be it water, be it air pollution, be it whatever, at least work together with the people within your own major group, so that you are informed and that you can speak on behalf of the NGOs and not only on behalf of yourself. Use the coffee bars and receptions. That's very important. What's also important is to be part of the dinners and the dancings and the drinks. That's of course not for all countries, but in Europe it really helps if one of those delegates from the EU, after a few beers, they're much more open for to talk and to be, let's say, more transparent on what's happening behind the walls. If you're spending more than 20% of the time with other stakeholders and not with member states or other key people that are necessary for your points to make, you're not doing your job. I think 20% is quite a lot, but let's say big part of your time you should spend with member states and others. Next slide. It's good to know what you have to do, but it's also good to know what you can't do during a meeting. There is a protocol, of course. So once you are at a UNEA meeting or in CPR or whatever, I mean, there is a protocol that member states speak first, and then the major groups receive instructions from the civil society unit, how many minutes we can speak, how many intervention we can make. Sometimes they ask us to work together with other major groups. So when we have, let's say, 4 speaking slots, then we have to organize ourselves as major group, how we are going to work together. So we have the 4 speaking slots because we are with 9 major groups. Of course, do not go to governments. I mean, the governments are having their own seats in front. Major groups are sitting on the last rows. Don't go to a government when they are speaking, because that's very disturbing, of course. Also, what is prohibited is to sit in a government seat. On the slide, you read that unless you are on that government's delegation, even a lot of delegations also ask to the people that are not part of the officials, not to sit on the seats, at least not on the seat that is behind the microphone. So normally you don't sit on a government seat. Do not interrupt in a meeting. So you cannot just ask for the floor, nor in the plenaries, nor in the breakout groups. I mean, it's not done to just interrupt in a meeting. Another thing what is also not done is target the government in your intervention. If it's about saying that you really like the intervention of whatever country, that's fine, but don't say that what Egypt is saying is nonsense, or we don't agree on that. I mean, try to be as concrete as possible on your content, but as vague as possible on your ideas on what countries are saying, unless indeed it's about to echo, to applaud an intervention from a country. Well, do not wear inappropriate clothes. I think that's obvious. I also don't really have a definition on what is appropriate, but let's say you're in an official meeting with ministers, ambassadors, etc. So I think you have to kind of clothe yourself a little bit according to those to these settings. What is not permitted is having a demonstration inside the venue. Sometimes often youth delegation is asking for a kind of thing to do, an event. You can ask for it. Often you get a permission, depends on what it is, but it has to be controlled. I mean, it is a member state negotiation event. It's not a summit or something where you can just have your protests and demonstrations, etc. But of course, if things are really going bad, I think it's also obvious that major groups, or often NGOs and youth and women groups, are doing things that are, let's say, limited. I mean, they are, but very often very creative and nice. Of course, do not take a country's flag or name. So if you're sitting behind the flags of the major groups, but never, of course, behind the flag or name of a country. What is also important is once you, because there are always a lot of negotiations also on the speech that NGOs or other major groups are going to say. So it's not only member states that negotiate, it's also major groups that negotiate on the text, I mean, on our priorities, etc. So once we agreed on a text that is the 3 minutes, and we agreed on the person that is going to read it out, then don't start to talk about other things. Because that is, I mean, that's very disloyal to the rest of your major group. And I mean, it's that I think that will be then the last time that you could speak on behalf of that major group if you start to talk about other things. And I think that's fair as well, because at the end, it's a process, it's a group process, it's a team. So we have to agree all together on what the priorities are and what kind of things we are going to say in the meeting. So then, of course, you have to stick to that as well. Next slide. That's the poll. Charles?
Okay, we'll have the third and final poll. Let's get that up. This poll is, why are you thinking of attending UNEA 5? We have 108 participants still with us. So let's see if we can get a good number of responses. And we'll let this go for, let's say, about 30 seconds.
And you can answer more than one. It's multiple choice.
Thank you for pointing that out. Well done. Just while we're waiting for the poll, we're running a little bit behind. We were meant to start our Q&A at 3:05, so we're running about 10 minutes over, just to make you guys aware of that. We have a little over 40% voted. Let's see if we can get that up a bit. Some people, of course, might not be going. So we're now, I'd like to at least get to 50% before we stop. Almost there. Okay. Okay, we are at 50%. So let's see what it looks like. There we go. We've got the largest percentage are to network with other stakeholders and learn more about how intergovernmental negotiations work. Despite the fact that Lida and Felix recommend not spending more than 20% of your time with other stakeholders. So, but this is all a learning process. So thank you very much for that. We'll share those results with you. And let us move on to the next section.
Yeah, it's the last slide of this section.
Got the last slide for this section, okay.
It is a summary. So it's really about knowing your own goals and know the decision-making process in your country, know when to work and at what level, having awareness of the decision-making context, the tools at your disposal, what you can do, where you can have openings for civil society to engage, when to make your position. So it's really about being on the right time, in the right room, on the right points of the agenda. So don't talk about other things, even if it's very important, but I mean, really follow the agenda. So when to make your positions. Know of course, your governmental officials and UN officials, knowing your allies, but I mean, if you spend most of your time with other stakeholders, then I'm sure you know your allies at least, but also within the member states. Also know your adversaries. It's also good to know your limits. So be focused and not too ambitious, I think, but be very concrete on things and know your brackets and terms. Thank you.
Icon, that was an excellent session. Thank you so very much. Let's take some questions. Now, we originally allowed 15 minutes for this period because it was a long session, but let's see how we do with questions. Maybe we can catch up on some time. Okay, let's start with a question for Lida. Are the government representatives really so open to speaking with strangers from major groups? At the meetings I have been to, they usually seem very busy, sleep deprived, and therefore unapproachable. Felix is laughing.
Yeah.
Well, how about you take that first, please?
Well, if they're sleepy, then I think you just have to give them a coffee or something.
Give them a nudge.
No, but that's true. I mean, of course they are busy, and especially when there is a lot going on, and if there is a lot of tension, sometimes you have a lot of tension on a certain topic or whatever, then of course they are less open to just do the chit chat with you on where they are, because then they, especially, well, in my case, of course, I follow mostly the EU delegation. So indeed they have to talk with the 28 to 27 other member states, and then they tend to be a little bit stressy and so on. But I mean, if you find a moment, I think that then it is possible. And what we normally do with the EU, and we also do that with the other regional groupings, is just to ask for a meeting where all the NGOs and other major groups are, so they don't need to explain 9 times the same thing, but that at least we have a kind of dialogue with the regional groupings, to know where they are, and then I think they're quite open. Especially, I think the Latin Americans are always open. EU is very open. G77 depends a little bit on the person, but I mean, I think it is possible. But again, then you really need to talk about the agenda. If you start to talk about all the little problems or big problems even from your country or whatever, they're not interested in that. I mean, not at that moment. Of course, they're interested in that, but they can't do anything with it. So it's really, you have to be concrete on the agenda. So that's why it is so important to do your homework and really try to, well, try to get in the head of those delegates, which kind of things they have to deal with, and try to support them there as well, of course, with your own points.
Yeah, just a couple of things on that. I mean, I think the one thing to remember is that the civil servants are not the political party in power. And so you may be very angry, for example, in the United States about the Trump administration. The civil servants who are in the negotiations, unless they're political appointments, are civil servants. They've been there for their life. They're trying to do the best they can. And so you have to think about the individual as much as what you're trying to achieve. And so again, over time, you build a relationship with the individual, which is more than just a conversation about policy. It's a conversation about them. They become your friends. And then they, you know, I mean, I had the US delegation all went to the toilet at the same time when they should have been voting against something, because I'd built a relationship with them. So there actually was congressional policy that they should vote against a summit, which would have been Johannesburg. But as they were at the toilet, they couldn't vote against it. So it went through. So you can build those personal relationships over time. The problem with UNEA is it's partly too short for that. You've got a very short period. And so that's why building the relationship in capital is even more important. When we go to the high level political forum, it's 2 weeks. So there's a longer time period. It's also not a policy space most of the time. And so they've got more time. So I think, you know, the more you can try and get to know these people before they go to Nairobi, the more likelihood is that they'll be very happy to go for a coffee with you because, you know, they see you as a mate as opposed to just someone who's trying to get this paragraph in. And I think for me, that's been my success, which is over time, you know, so that I won't mention the country, but one country only had 50% of instructions for Rio Plus 20. And then it was up to the mission in New York, what they wanted to do. And so because I had a very good relationship with this country, I got a lot of text through that mission because of the personal relationships I built. So I think it's not surprising that the polls show people learning about the process being an important part of it. Is part of the way of becoming a better lobbyist. And the other thing is, you know, there are issues that you may very well want to raise for the future, which is not in the biodiversity focus area now. But there'll be many people at the at UNEA who may also feel similar to you about an issue, maybe on, as we talked about, climate refugees. And you could start to get together a group of people in that stakeholder space to start to define some space which could be part of UNEA 6. And so you can use that space to develop a narrative which you can take forward. So that's also very useful.
Thank you, Felix. I'm going to answer a couple questions. One, in terms of dealing with the media, we're going to be discussing that tomorrow. There's an entire section on the media, so we won't answer that question today. Also, there was a question for Felix about the HLPF. Again, I would say if you're able to join us on Monday for the launch of our paper about the future of the HLPF, but if you can't, it will be on the Stakeholder Forum website. The very brief webinar, which is going to be the presentation, and the document will be posted as well. We've got a couple other very quick questions, but since we're running a bit behind. One question is, so there's no way to give our input if we are not part of the UNEA 5 physically?
No, that's not true. You can do it through, as we've talked about, there's going to be an online discussion and input on the 6th of October. So there's an opportunity there. There'll be an opportunity through when we know them, through the regional virtual meetings. So you'll have that. And there's as Lyda said, if you go to the UNEA website, you go and look at the major group representatives and ask what systems they have for their preparatory process for their position. So absolutely, you should be able to engage by not going.
Most of the time, all the intervention and positions are made on a Google Doc. So even if you're not physically in Nairobi, you can give your inputs there and follow everything. Be part of the WhatsApp group. I mean, I'm now talking for the major group of NGOs, but I know that the women's group has the same. I think it's even more active. So yes, you can. Of course, you always miss something, but having your content delivered within in those position papers is possible.
Let's just take one more question and we'll move on. Can the UN organizations in countries assist governments or NGOs in this process?
So in the context of, it depends on the government. So the governments in certain places may have a process already set up to consult. It's less now than it used to be, I think. But there is in a sense an obligation that they should do that, but I don't think so many of them do as they used to. As far as UN agencies are concerned, that they don't really have a role for UNEA. They might in some developing countries have a fund to help developing country NGOs go to a couple of meetings. Sometimes there's money in the larger UNDP officers which might support that, or within the Norwegian embassy or Danish embassy in certain countries, they'd have a discretionary fund which might help you to attend.
Thank you for that. Lyda, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, in some countries and fortunately in more countries, you have those councils, those sustainable development councils. Those councils are always together also with stakeholders. And then I think that's maybe also a channel that you can use, asking the council to have a position on UNEA or on any other thing that has to deal with environmental sustainable development. And that also helps to set up that dialogue between government and stakeholders, to use that, I mean, if you have one in your country, to use those advisory councils.
So that's another webinar for Charles to organize with the councils, maybe November.
Good idea. Thank you, Felix. Okay, let's move on. Thank you very much to the two of you. Felix, just to say to our audience, this is the final module of today. Don't forget, of course, we have 2 sessions tomorrow. Felix, over to you.
Yeah, so it dawned on me that it perhaps would be interesting to look at it from the other side. So what is a government official also thinking about? Because we're looking at it from our side, it's interesting to look at it from their side. So what is it like to be a government official? How do they decide their positions and their red lines? How they negotiate, how they build alliances, and then how, just a little bit on how to write a UN resolution. Okay, so next slide. So that's a bit small. I guess we'll have to deal with it. This was orientated more around New York, but it kind of applies to Nairobi. The mission staff in this case would be the ones working around the CPR. And if you imagine yourself as a new person coming in, their role as they came in would be to support their ambassador, to make sure the ambassador gets a good profile, whether it's in New York or whether it's in Nairobi or Rome or Geneva. They'd also be there to support, if they're a new person, to support their counselor or first secretary, to again make sure that they have a role. So as a new person, just as you're a new person going to UNEA, they would be looking for similar types of roles to be played, but in the context of the government. They would be building a relationship with their capital desk officer. And so, you know, that's really important. So if they're a new mission person coming in, what can you do? Well, you can become their best friend and perhaps introduce them to some of the best places in Nairobi, if you're based in Nairobi or in New York, so that they know where they can get a good cafe or a good meal. You can help them to get their ambassador some speaking slots on particular things, so that you're helping them to profile their particular ambassador or first secretary or counselor. If you're dealing with capital desk officers, it may be that you already have a relationship with that capital desk officer because you've already been dealing with them. It may be that you can help link them to some of the other people who have been engaged in the UNEA 5 from some of the other departments, because you've already got that relationship. It may be that you have a particular interest in a particular issue, and therefore you know who the key UN staff are, so you can help them in building a relationship with them. By making yourself useful in this way, you're also building a relationship which can benefit when you want something to advance as far as policy is concerned. Next slide. So when they come in, they'll be going into a political grouping, whether it's the EU or the G77. So I've had a situation in New York where I met the number 3 at the Nigerian mission, who just started. He'd just gone to Habitat 3, and he came up to me and said he just arrived at the Nigerian mission, and did I know who would be a good person for him to be linking in with. So I actually made introductions to who were the top 5 or 10 G77 people who were the movers and shakers in New York. In the end, this person then pioneered a resolution through the General Assembly for me, which I'd been working on for 3 years. And so in a sense, it paid off really well. But there are also a number of friends groups. This isn't so true for Nairobi. And I think this is a missing element in the Nairobi architecture. But in New York, there'll be there's a Friends of Climate Change government group. I'm the secretary to a Friends of Governance for Sustainable Development group. There'll be a Friends of Children group. There'll be a Friends of Biodiversity. There's a Friends of Voluntary Reports group. These groups exist to, in a sense, enable member states to have a space where they can have informal conversations, where they can take off their government hats and actually discuss something way ahead of when there has to be a decision. And so they play a critical role. And a new person coming in may not be aware of those kinds of things. And so being able to help them to engage with those is another thing that you can do. Next slide. UN staff. So whenever a new delegate comes in, they won't know who the key UN staff is. It's very unlikely, except in the larger developed country delegations, that there'll be a proper handover to someone coming in. And so if you know who the key people are in the UN team, and we've just put up some of them in the context of the management of UNEP, but there are people underneath that, then you can play a role in introducing them. And so you play a role in helping them with their social life, in engaging with those. Again, more probably relevant in New York than it is in Nairobi, because as I said, the Nairobi time that we're there is so much shorter. But you know, there are, for example, in New York, the French-speaking UN delegates have a group which meets to speak French and to go to French restaurants and whatever. If you've got someone coming in from Senegal, they might not know that. It would be a great thing to introduce them to. And again, it plays a critical role in helping them to feel their way in a new place, but also that they are aware that you did that. Next one. There's also an issue around they want to be an expert. So they want to have an impact. Now, their natural tendency will always be to be conservative, because when they come in, they'll be wanting to just get a lay of the land. So the quicker you can help them to become comfortable with the lay of the land, the quicker you can get them to move beyond what is usually a very conservative position as a new delegate when they're coming in. And some of that is linking them in with some of the experts or the think tanks that are around issues that they are going to cover with, so that they can start to access information. So it may not be information that you particularly have, though that's useful, that you show that you have that expertise. But if you're showing that you're more broadly helping them to find the right access to experts on issues that they are going to be covering, then that's also very useful. We have the former chair of Stakeholder Forum, Derek Osborne, was the former Director General of the Department of Environment in the UK. And he said that there are three types of stakeholders: the knowledgeable, the powerful, and the well-meaning. And so he would advise his staff to be very close to the people who were knowledgeable and powerful, and polite to the ones that were well-meaning. If you're knowledgeable, and if you're powerful in either as an organization or as a coalition, then most governments will listen to you. So that's really important. Okay, next slide. So how to negotiate. So as we were kind of inferring earlier, one of the problems that we have at the moment is everything is online and people can tweet whatever you say. And you need to think about that, because if you do something which has a negative impact on the civil servant that's sitting there, then that's going to have a negative impact on that person, and they're not likely to take an interest in you in the future. And remember, the relationship you create with these individuals also has an impact on other people's relationships. So if you happen to cause them to be unhappy in the sense of the way you've behaved, that may have an impact on their relationship with any other NGO that they engage in, or that they talk to. So you have to be very careful. So it's not good to tweet what a delegate says. It may seem very good. Oh my God, it's horrendous. Well, that person may not actually believe that. It may just be what their government is saying and that they're representing it. And actually, outside at the coffee bar, they're trying to do a deal similar to what you're trying to do. So just be very sensitive to that. So just a few terms. Silent procedure is when the chair of the process or the moderator feels that they have got an agreement. And if they've got the agreement, they put it under silent procedure for a period of time, which allows governments to go back to capital to say that they are okay or not okay with that. These are more for the resolutions that are in New York. Agreed as ref means that, which will appear at the end of the paragraphs, means that paragraph's been agreed. So in theory, there's no way you can change it. They've already agreed it. Inter alia is used so that you don't have to list everything. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So even though you've got those inter alia paragraphs there, until the whole agreement is gone through silent procedure and agreed, then it's not agreed. So there is still a chance to do things. Next slide. So again, we go back to some of the things that that Lida talked about, but which is also important to think about. You know, what is the government timetable? So you can just ask them, you know, so when are you making your final decision, or when are you inputting to resolutions that are coming up for UNEA 5? When are you going to, if you happen to be in G77, when do you think G77 will finalize that? And they'll have specific people in G77 who will be leading those resolutions. They'll apply, you know, different countries will take responsibility for different resolutions. So it's important to work out who these are. As we've said before, that you have to be aware of both the people in Nairobi and the people in capital. So though you'll build a relationship in capital, you should also be finding out who that person in Nairobi is going to be, so that you're at least exchanging emails before you attend the meeting, so that they know. There'll be red lines, and if you're on delegation, you'll know what those red lines are, where they're not meant to go beyond those unless there's been an agreement. And there will be some flexibility in that. When you find you have a good relationship with a government, you'll usually find out the level of instructions that they've had and whether or not, where the flexibility is. And once you know that, then you can start to move particular issues. And if you've built the relationship, you can move issues quite well with that particular country. So it is, again, something over time that you're able to build. You need to have transparency in the context of your own organization, so that people are aware of what everybody's doing. And so building up those WhatsApp groups is quite critical. Negotiators, as I said before, are usually civil servants, not political appointments. It's not always the case. Sometimes you'll find political appointments, but you need to know if the political appointments are there. We've had a situation where we've advanced with the US government. This was under the Bush administration, quite far in a particular way. And then the politicos came in and just kind of undermined the whole process. So you just have to be aware that that might happen, even if you've built it up with the civil servants. Next slide. And so that's the end of that module, and questions, and then sleep for me.
Hey, Felix, thank you very much for that. Lida, if you'd like to come back in, let's see what we have in the way of questions. Let's see. There are, here we go. In terms of negotiating or lobbying for support from states, is it okay to approach embassies in countries?
Yes, I mean, if you're, I assume you mean that. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean in the sense of the ones in Nairobi?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I suppose it said embassies in countries. I suppose.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes. So if you were going to approach, if you were in India, would you approach the Belgium mission or the Belgium embassy?
Yeah.
It's not the way that they're not going to be engaged in this process.
No.
You would need to work with Belgium NGOs, and they would put you in contact if it was relevant with the relevant person in the Belgian government, I would say. What do you say, Lida?
Yeah, exactly. No, I don't think that that's the task of the ambassadors that are based in a certain country.
Yeah.
So no, I mean the ambassadors in Nairobi, they I mean they're often part of the kind of permanent mission, the perm reps. So then I think that's not always, but I mean the often the technical mission of a country is based in the embassy.
Thank you both for that. Let's see if we have any more questions. The only other comment in the question and answer box was something sort of directed towards UNEP. I kindly request that UNEP to send the list of accredited CSOs to the respective countries.
They are on the website of UNEP, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, all the accredited organizations are there.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're listed or you can filter them per country or they're in alphabetical order, but I suppose you can filter them per country.
Yeah.
Okay.
I saw, and that was not in the Q&A, but in the chat, someone from Nairobi. In Nairobi, the NGOs are quite active, of course, because they are near the campus. And I just want to inform you that the African Network of Animal Welfare, ANAW, they just offered themselves as being a liaison office for major groups in general. So a liaison office, I mean, it's not really functioning yet because it's really starting, but at least they have staff and they want to be the liaison, as it says in the word, between the major group facilitating committee and all kind of other NGOs. The problem with the major group facilitating committee is that we have, I mean, we have a lot of people there, 18 plus 12 observers, but they're all outside Nairobi. I mean, most of them are all outside Nairobi. They have full-time jobs, etc. So it's really on top of their job. So they are doing their best. I'm not saying that they're not, but they're limited. I mean, limited in time. So we really felt the need. That's why Stakeholder Forum also came with the initiative to open a liaison office in Nairobi, to have people full-time working in dispatching the right information, not only where the meeting is going on, but also on content to things. I now found the, I mean, we had a coordination with them. They found the funding for that, and they are now opening that office. So that's something I think you have to look at as well, or how that's going to develop. Hopefully, it's developing well, because then it also says that we have a physical presence as major groups in Nairobi, which I think is very good.
Thank you both for your answer to that. There are no more questions in the Q&A. So I would basically just turn to Felix and Lida to see if you want to make any last comments before I just do a final wrap up and a reminder about tomorrow. Lida, how about over to you? Any final words for today?
No, I think it's a lot to digest for people that are online, but hopefully we will all see you back tomorrow.
We've just had a couple more questions in, and we do have time for a couple more questions. Do countries often include NGOs in the negotiation process who are not civil servants or political appointees? Do governments ever politically appoint NGO members? Now, you obviously, we've addressed that. Do you want to say one more word about that? So I'll read it again. Do countries often include NGOs in the negotiation process who are not civil servants or political appointees? Do governments ever politically appoint NGO members?
They do not appoint them. I mean, it's an open process normally that they say, okay, we have a seat for a youth representative or an NGO, whatever. So then normally, I mean, let's say in democratic countries, normally they just ask who is willing to do so, but they are not going to select one. If they do, I think that would be against my feeling of democracy, because it's civil society who decides who's going to be on the delegation and how the information and feedback is given as well, because you're not only there to be part of the delegation, you're also there to inform your constituency in your country on what's happening and where we are going. So yes, I mean, some countries are quite open and others are not. And then, I mean, you have NGOs that are maybe not on the delegation, but quite close. But only they're really appointed by the government, but that's what we call the gongos.
But I think so. I think there are different countries operate different decision-making processes. So even though Canada is quite illuminated, their process has often been the government choosing particular particular NGOs to be on the delegation. So I think it differs. I think Leila is absolutely right. It should be a process which is open, where, yeah, in a sense, the stakeholder group makes the decision on who that should be. But, you know, in the end, if we end up with more people on delegations, that's also a good thing as well. I think the other thing to think about is that I think the question was more related to the role of the person on the delegation. So, you know, if you sign up, as was indicated in the PowerPoint, in certain cases, Canada's a good example. You have to sign an agreement with the Foreign Office, and if you don't sign it, you don't go on the delegation, and then you're legally bound in whatever way. I don't know. Maybe they send you to Alberta or something if you don't do what you're meant to do. But you then have to adhere to what they are saying. So if they decide to put you in the seat, which in the case of Canada at different points they have done, you have to represent whatever the government position is. That you know, you can't just present the NGO position. So, you know, if you are on delegation and if you are given a responsibility to sit in the delegate seat and present, and that's happened a number of times, it has to be what is in that the agreement of that government.
Felix, thank you for that. On that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up. We'll be back tomorrow. Let me just say a few words before you all go. I'll just move to our closing slide. Just to say that I want to say many thanks to all of you for joining us today, and to the United Nations Environment Program for their cooperation and contributions. Also to Felix and Leila for delivering today's very rich content. Please do not forget to join us tomorrow for the second half of this capacity building training. Also note that those who participate on both days will be entitled to a continuing education certificate, which we will issue in the days following completion of the webinars. Also note that the webinar is being recorded, and that recording by way of a link to the SF YouTube page and a copy of the presentations will be posted on the Stakeholder Forum website after completion of the 2-day sessions. Finally, please stick around just briefly afterwards. A very short survey will pop up when the webinar ends. Please do take a few moments to complete it. It would help us greatly. And with that, thank you, best wishes, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at the same time. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye.